Good evening. It is now 6:30, and I will call the Monday, March 26, 2018 Planning Commission meeting to order. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Our first item on tonight's agenda is approval of the agenda. Has everyone had an opportunity to review that, and are there any changes? Seeing no changes, I would stand for a motion.
So moved. Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And the motion carries. Our second item on the agenda this evening is approval of the minutes of the February 26, 2018 Planning Commission meeting. Are there any changes from the commissioner staff on those minutes?
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Benke?
the only thing I noticed was under the Prince of Peace item that the discussion of the additions integration into the original architecture was left off. The original architecture of the building.
I'd lean on Deb for that. I wasn't.
It talks about reflects site and overall objectives of PUD, but it didn't talk about the rest.
Well, the minutes are just an overview. They're the actual meeting minutes, folks can go back to and review the entire thing.
Okay.
But if you'd like changes,
No.
we can certainly
No,
do that.
I'm fine with it then.
Okay.
Okay. If there's no other changes, I would stand for a motion.
So
move.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And I'll abstain, and opposed, and the motion carries. Our third item of the evening is a item for the Planning Commission work plan to review the solar ordinance. And presenting that this evening is Ms. Dean and a few others. Ms. Garris.
Here.
Missed a few meetings and I forgot what you looked like. Don't put that in the minutes, Deb.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioners. This evening, we've got two discussion items on for the Planning Commission. And this first one is if I can get this up here. Here we go. I need technology, and I'm not good at it. All right. The first one is actually a Planning Commission work plan item, and that is an annual review of the solar ordinance. Just in general, the city, before we amended our ordinance here a couple of years ago, had provisions dating back to 1982. There were about 2 sentences, basically just requiring that solar installations be screened, and that's about the extent of any provisions. In terms of how the ordinance was developed, for those that were not here, there were several work session meetings that were held throughout a couple of years by the Planning Commission and then Planning Commission and City Council. Council consensus was to proceed to draft an ordinance to include performance standards, yard location, setbacks, visibility standards, including architectural and aesthetic provisions. This is an item from the council work session. These are their minutes, and just wanted to call your attention to the center point area where the council, in terms of solar opportunities and issues, ordinance amendments should include aesthetic guidelines and setbacks, concerns about aesthetics, freestanding pole-mounted installations, concerns about residential rooftops, and panels being rotated. They knew that technology was quickly advancing and that they would like to see the city incorporate solar when possible into city projects. So those are reviewed with all of the city projects. And that solar devices, once they're no longer working, that they be removed. So the ordinance was set up to address that. And then we also took a look at impervious surface of solar panels and incorporated those changes. The ordinance, there were 2 public hearings that were held by the Planning Commission in January and February of 2016. The City Council adopted the current ordinance, which is part of the city code. And the Planning Commission, you received a copy of it with your background report. That was approved in March of 2016. And last year, on March 27th, you had your first annual review of the ordinance. At that time, through the Planning Commission discussion, basically the Planning Commission identified that you'd like to continue to support building integrated solar options as a preference, and then take a look at additional solar beyond that, and some of the items that we identified as being some building integrated or technologies that the Planning Commission supported are just shown on the graphics. And then we looked at commercial and residential, and again, the purpose of the ordinance or the intent of the ordinance is to allow building integrated technologies pretty much with just a standard building permit and very few other standards or requirements. We looked at a number of different residential applications, and the intent was to encourage, again, building integrated when we seek residential applications, and that would include things like the solar shingles, tapes, and just different ways of integrating those into residential buildings. We also took a look at, and continued again, to take a look at, as far as the aesthetic standards, kind of what was the city looking for. And these are various graphics through the earlier work sessions and also last year that we took a look at in terms of what would be thought of as positive and negative or less visual type installations that Planning Commission was not supportive of. And this just again shows these examples. In terms of commercial permits, we've had a number of commercial permits for solar installations. Generally, there have been no issues with those. They have all been able to either locate the panels on the rooftop such that you can't see them from view from the public street or adjacent properties. And a lot of times there are existing parapets that also help to provide the screening. So we've had a number of installations and no issues with those. For residential solar, however, there have been a number of permits and various issues that have come up this year, and they're pretty much all related to the design and the arrays, the configuration of the solar panels when we're dealing with single-family developments. The ordinance is set up to have a conditional use permit provision so that if staff cannot administratively approve a building permit, they have the opportunity to come before Planning Commission and Council. You can take a look at the specific site conditions, the screening, the location, et cetera, and then make a decision related to conditional use permit. Some of the examples of different things that we've received, I'm just going to show on the screen quickly, and I think others will address this as well. This is an application where they're looking at, again, single family. This would be another one. Things I wanted to note for Planning Commission is that there are a number of existing types of construction that preclude the ability to basically have a close together band of solar panels. We have roof vents, various stacks. There are people that have windows and other items that are associated with development in Minnesota. So with those existing conditions, it's somewhat difficult to meet the city's ordinance. And I think with that, those are the comments that I have. Just wanted to provide Planning Commission with an overview. And we have two different speakers this evening. We have Brian Ross, who will speak to the Planning Commission first. He's with the Great Plains Institute, and Brian has been instrumental in helping the city develop our sustainability plan and other plans and projects that we have had. So he has got a presentation that he would like to give the Planning Commission a review on, kind of the general an introductory to solar technologies and the environment that we're working in today. He has also worked with the state to develop some model ordinance language and is very familiar with those aspects, so he is here. And then following him, we have Brian Allen, who is with All Solar Energy, and they are a contractor for residential installations. They too have an application, or excuse me, a presentation, and then they would be available also for questions and answers. And we do have some folks in the audience that also may like to address the Planning Commission as well. This is completely a discussion item at the purview of the Planning Commission, and it's really the opportunity to listen in and take a review as to what has occurred over the past year, and then to provide staff any feedback as to potential changes you might want to see in the ordinance, or if you want to leave the ordinance as is. The whole gamut is really open to Planning Commission based on your discussion. Following that, if there are ordinance changes, then staff would go back and we would draft an ordinance and pursue the public hearing process, hold the required public notices, and bring those back for Planning Commission review. So with that, Brian Ross.
Thank you, Deb.
And I think,
And are you going to control the,
I'm gonna see if I'm gonna,
oh, thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, for inviting me to come. And I first have to apologize. I was supposed to be coming from home to here, and instead I stayed at work late and realized I didn't have on my meeting clothes.
You look
So-
just fine.
We appreciate you coming.
So I either had to choose between being 20 minutes late or being appropriately dressed. So I chose to be here on time.
I'm gonna need some help from the back room there to pull this up.
Like magic.
Thank you. We go from this to, there's a PowerPoint presentation. And it would be this one here. And how did you do that?
So you,
Escape?
It's a secret.
yeah, you just hit escape, and I had them all loaded up here.
Okay.
Otherwise, you can always load them up from here as well.
Okay.
But I already kind of preloaded for you. And it's-
All right, thank you.
Yep.
And I'll just advance them, you let me know
Okay,
when
so
you'd
I'll
like to
give you
do
the
that.
cue when it's the investor. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. Great, just to kind of, presentation I put together is something that, material that we've had for some time. I was going to go into any great detail about the kind of specific best practices for zoning and solar, but we can, in your questions and kind of, if you wanted to dive deeper, I'm happy to do that. I actually have a 2-hour presentation that I can do on the same topic. If you're so much of a planning geek as I am that you really want to see that, I'd be happy to do that as well. So go ahead, next slide. So the Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit organization. We've been around for 20 years. Our mission, our humble mission, as we like to say, is transforming the way we produce, distribute, consume energy to be both environmentally and economically sustainable in our society. Go to the next slide. And we have several different programs and efforts. We work on a national basis on some things, all the way down to a local basis on others. We have about 30 people in the organization. I work in the communities division of Great Plains Institute, where we do work primarily with local and regional governments. We do work across the Midwest in some degree at the national level, but primarily most of our work is probably in Minnesota and surrounding states. The kind of programs that we currently are working on in the Communities Division include some of the ones that are listed here on the slide. The Grow Solar Partnership is actually one that has just recently ended as a program, but it is where a lot of the material that we're talking about in terms of the model ordinances and the toolkit that I'll be presenting were developed in. The SolSmart program is a current and ongoing program. It's a national certification program for solar-ready communities, funded by the Department of Energy, run by the Solar Foundation and the National League of Cities and the National City Managers Association. I can't remember, several other associations associated with local governments, in order to certify communities that have achieved a certain standard of solar readiness as it meets national best practices. And we have rolled a lot of the material that we've done out of the Grow Solar Partnership into that program, and we have been participating in that in Minnesota as well at the regional and national scale. I was on the national committee that helped develop the national best practices for that program, and am continuing to be an advisor to that. We also run the Green Step Cities program, or co-direct the Green Step Cities program. Burnsville is one of our star communities in the Green Step Cities program. I was, before I got to the Great Plains Institute, I actually helped create Green Step Cities when I was running my consultant business, something that sustainability work has been a primary portion of my work. We also house the Metro Clean Energy Resource Team, Metro CERTS, and I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they do a lot of projects around the metro area for clean energy. They are a statewide partnership that works on clean energy projects. Their annual conference is coming up this Wednesday and Thursday. If you happen to be so inclined to drive to St. Cloud and join 600 of your best friends talking about clean energy, you're welcome to do that. And then we also do provide some sustainability assistance and technical assistance directly to communities on an ad hoc basis when it meets our mission in our community's program. So I just want to launch straight into this, and the kind of question, the thing that comes up frequently when we do our solar energy work, is why do we need to do solar zoning? Which hit it again, and then again. I think that there's one of those rolling text boxes. One of the things that we try to help everybody keep in mind about why we're doing solar zoning is, and the things that have changed actually pretty substantially over the last 5 years, and certainly over the last 10 years, is that the markets and the information around solar have changed dramatically in that time frame. Solar resources are now an economically viable resource at the local level. 5 years ago, we would have been pressed to say that. 10 years ago, we would have been laughed out of the room to say that. It is, in fact, now true. Levelized cost of solar energy, even at the residential scale, is actually cost competitive with utility power. So this is something that has become an economic resource, and we are urging communities to kind of view their solar resources as they would any other kind of valuable economic resource in the community. If you have, aggregate resources, if you have agricultural resources, if you have land resources that are valuable for development, those are things you need to accommodate and think about kind of balancing the different ways that development occurs as you move forward to capture both the local benefits and minimize the risks associated with that. And solar is going to be no different. It is a valuable resource to be developed, but you have to kind of balance things and make tough decisions along the way. Because it's an economically valuable resource, people will want to develop their resource. And this is only going to increase in intensity in over time. As solar costs continue to come down, and they will continue to come down, as utility electric costs will probably continue to creep up over time, it will just change that dynamic more and more people will want to capture the resources that they will view as part of their property rights on their homes or businesses. Third is that Burnsville already, as a Green Step City and as a sustainability leader, you already have policy priorities that really encourage the development of clean energy options. And so one of the things that we want to help you do is kind of recognize what those best practices are nationally, how they may be adapted in the city of Burnsville to meet your community standards, and move forward in a way that allows the capture at the community level of a valuable solar resource and the environmental benefits associated with it, as well as kind of meeting your other, sometimes in conflict, other goals that you might have in your community, which I'll touch on in a little bit. So one of the things that we do talk about with communities very frequently, especially as communities are doing their comprehensive plans, are that they need to recognize that there is this solar resource out there. We can actually, something we couldn't do 10 years ago, we can do now, we can actually calculate what this resource is. It is a measurable resource, and we talk about this as a local solar energy reserve. If I asked you what your oil reserves were in Burnsville, you would say, well, we don't have any oil reserves in Burnsville, but you would know what an oil reserve is. And so we try to talk about solar energy in the same way because you do have a solar energy reserve. And this is a couple of numbers that we put up here on the screen about what Burnsville's solar energy reserve is. We have calculated it. This has been done for all of the communities in the metropolitan area, all 188 local governments, as well as a number of them out in greater Minnesota that we're working with. And the important point here that kind of starts to make sense is what we call the rooftop solar reserve. This is just the reserve. This is the economically producible solar that is on the rooftops of buildings in the city of Burnsville. And you can see that there is the number that, some of these numbers probably don't make any sense to people who aren't in the utility business, but the one that does make sense is that the rooftop solar reserve in Burnsville is approximately equal to 70% of the total electric energy consumption in the city. If you were to capture the entire reserve, that's how much you would be generating. So you can see that this is a demonstration of how economically viable this resource is, or how economically important it is, and the size of it. I hit the down arrow because there's one more thing on here that we actually also calculated for the city of Burnsville. Just if you did the top 10 projects in the city, the 10 biggest roofs that have a solar resource, and you develop them, you would generate an equivalent amount of electricity to meet 5.5% of the total electric energy use in the city. That's a pretty substantial number. Now, those are big roofs. Now, you probably know exactly which ones they are, being on the Planning Commission. But this is, again, a demonstration of the economic viability of this resource and the importance of it as we move forward and think about development in the city of Burnsville. So we have, as part of our project that we had, the Grow Solar Partnership, we developed what we call our 5 principles of what it means to be a solar-ready community. And they're fairly straightforward, and I think this is not a surprise for people who are on the Planning Commission. But really, the 5 principles are: you need comprehensive plans that describe the solar resources and encourage appropriate solar development. You need development regulations that explicitly address solar development in its varied forms, because not all solar development is the same. People tend to bundle all things solar into the same part of their ordinance, which you can do, but it's kind of like saying that a pole barn and an industrial factory are the same thing because they're both buildings. They're not. They have completely different standards. They're appropriate in completely different kinds of districts. There's different kinds of potential nuisances and potential synergies that are associated with them, and you need to think about this in your ordinance structure. You need permitting processes that are transparent and predictable and well documented. This is primarily going to be, it may be your conditional use permit in the zoning process, but it will also be your building code process, electric and building code. You need public sector investment in your community solar resources. You guys do have some solar here, right?
We participate with the Mid-Council program.
That's it, with the Community Solar Garden Program.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we do also, of course, encourage where possible that you have a visible sign of solar, but this is just one of those options that communities have in terms of public participation. And then finally, the final point of a solar-ready community is to have local programs that help address market barriers and failures in order to allow solar energy to be developed in a meaningful way. And this is something that local governments do fairly routinely. They call it economic development. You have ways you provide financing programs for appropriate development. You do sometimes bundling of parcels in order to kind of get the kind of thing you want. You set a variety of standards. You do education programs to encourage people to develop their properties in ways that are consistent with the goals you want to have. And these are the kinds of things that you need to think about, this context of those kinds of programs also for this resource that we're calling solar energy, because it is a developable resource, and it does require that kind of attention in order to get what you want out of it. So kind of quickly, comprehensive plan. What does it mean to have a comprehensive plan that is solar ready? Primarily, you need to identify and define solar resources, and then acknowledge the solar development benefits and co-benefits and the potential conflicts in the community associated with it, and again, different kinds of solar development. And this is the kind of process you guys are already involved with the Metropolitan Council and the update of the comprehensive plan. It is a requirement, as you probably know very well, that all communities have to have an element of their comprehensive plan that addresses the protection and development of solar resources. And that is something that has changed the way that's been, the way the expectations of how you do that have changed given the changes in the market and the changes in information that we've had around solar energy. Development regulations that are solar ready include explicitly addressing solar development in its varied forms, as I said, creating an as-of-right installation opportunity that meets your standards so that you don't have to go out and get additional permits or go through additional hearings, and then setting clear and predictable standards for balancing solar resources with other kinds of resources in the community. And this is the kind of thing where we say, how does, solar energy is a good thing, urban forests are a good thing, they don't necessarily go well together. How do we balance those two kinds of things that are both good in our development regulations? Permitting practices, you need to reduce the amount of time spent acquiring permits and inspections and doing inspections, make the process transparent and predictable to people on both sides of the counter. So the expectations are the same when the developer or the contractor goes up, they know exactly what's going to be required of them coming back to get the permit. Making sure that the permit is approximating industry best practices so that what Burnsville is doing is approximately the same as what Apple Valley is doing versus Bloomington and the surrounding communities, so you have an equivalent market for development across those jurisdictions. And then finally, establishing a permit fee that appropriately covers your local costs, but recognizes some of the differences that you might see with solar development versus other kinds of contract development. Go ahead. Private sector investment in the community, this is fairly straightforward. You guys have already made a fairly substantial investment in community solar gardens. There may be additional opportunities. In fact, there's a process that GPI is currently working on now to help local governments do actual installs on their own properties. We have similar to the Metropolitan Council process, which was a joint RFP and bid across 31 different local governments. We are currently putting together a similar bid, but this is for third-party provided solar under a purchase power agreement to local governments if they wanted to actually put a solar array on an actual building and potentially capture things like resiliency benefits and other kinds of benefits you might get out of such an installation. I'd be more than happy to talk about that, but I won't go into it anymore at this point in time. Go ahead. And then finally, of course, the local programs piece, which I already described, which is really about adapting the kind of programs you already have for things like workforce development and economic development to the solar market in terms of overcoming market barriers. Okay, go ahead. In order to do that, we developed a series of toolkits for local governments. We did this in 4 states, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Each one of those, we took national best practices for what it means to be solar ready that had been developed and applied in a number of states across the nation and said, what does this mean given the context of, for instance, Minnesota statutes and what local governments are enabled or prevented from doing in those states. And we looked at all 4 states and adapted the provisions of the toolkit to all 4 of those states. Go ahead. And each one of these toolkits has the same components to it. It includes a summary of the statutes that you need to be aware of that kind of guide what you can and can't do or what you're required to do in some cases in regard to solar development. Comprehensive plan guidance, land use regulation guidance in terms of principles, a model ordinance that provides language for a variety of different circumstances and that adapts national best practices, and then permitting guidance and a model permit checklist in order to meet those standards. Go ahead. So I'm just going to go right to the development regulation piece, and this is probably the key point to the discussion tonight, of course, is your solar ordinance and what this means. And I already had most of this information up here already. But just to emphasize that kind of some of the things we look at in this principle is about what it means to really adapt these national best practices and have some consistency in the ordinance, both with your community and with surrounding communities, is to recognize what are you need to remember that solar development is a new form of development to a lot of communities. And as a consequence, there's a lot of uncertainties about what does it mean, what are the risks, what are the impacts, how much does it cost, how much of it are we going to see, but also to recognize that you already have some things that are very similar to solar in your community, and to regulate like uses the same way. And we have seen, one of the problems we've seen, and some of the things that the best practices address on zoning in solar ordinances is to recognize that just because it's a new land use doesn't mean that the nuisances are all new associated with this. You have dealt with many of these things before, and to regulate things similarly as you would others. We have had, for instance, some communities that have chosen to apply certain submittal requirements for solar development that they don't require for similar land uses. And that was mainly done because they didn't know really what the solar development was all about, and they didn't have experience with it. And we just want to kind of take a step back and make sure that those standards are going to be the same across different kinds of uses. Some of the things that we need to address are, of course, how solar development fits in or does not fit in with other kinds of important resources or in regard to nuisances that you might see associated with development. Agricultural practices, this is something we see very similar when very frequently when we get outside the metro a little bit or at the edges of the metro where we're seeing community solar garden development and there's a perceived conflict with agricultural practices. And I have a whole series of standards that we can talk about why we want to protect agriculture and how solar does or does not affect that, and because there are so many misperceptions about what that means in communities. But similarly, as I mentioned earlier, things like urban forests. This is something that's good. Solar development is good. How do you deal with this? We actually, as a clean energy organization, we advocate that we would rather not see people cutting down trees in order to put up solar systems. And that's one of the reasons why we helped develop that solar energy map that is being used for the solar resource calculation. Because we wanted cities to see where the solar resource was right now, where there wasn't a shaded spot, where the trees were in fact not limiting it, in order to allow for that kind of how do we protect this solar resource. The solar resource is where the sun shines and where you have an economically viable amount of sunshine in order to produce electricity. It is not under a tree. That is not where a solar resource is. Historic resources are another thing where we do see conflict. It's an important thing, but how you put solar arrays on historic resources, whether they be designated buildings or in districts or other kinds of designations, is something that communities do have to address on a case-by-case basis, but there are standards that are applied nationally for that as well. Solar in airports, this is something that we frequently see. You may in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, they've been around long enough that you may have seen that there's about 3 or 4 megawatts worth of solar installed at the airport. It is something that many people perceive as a danger to airports because of issues like glare. In fact, airports are in many ways an ideal place to put solar. The FAA is very protective of glare standards around its control towers, but it has a whole system for how it evaluates that, and it has let probably over 1,000 megawatts of solar be developed at airports around the nation. We have actually the Indianapolis airport, I think, by itself has something like 200 or 300 megawatts worth of solar. I mean, that's a big number. So the kind of issue of how glare affects things might not be kind of what you think it is in terms of the risks that it poses. Natural areas and then community character are those other two things that have come up in terms of potential resources you need to address. And I think community character is kind of the issue that you guys have really been focusing on in terms of how you protect your community character. What are the impacts to surrounding buildings if someone does solar? And what are those kind of questions? Whoops. Yes. And I kind of wanted to get to the glare issue because this is one that I wanted to note, and I do note that you have some ordinance language around this in your existing ordinance. One of the misperceptions about solar panels is that they are a special characteristic, a special component, a special risk in regard to glare particularly in residential neighborhoods. And you'll notice that I have a lot of pictures of glare on this slide, and you'll notice that not one of them is a solar panel. Glare from a solar panel is reflected light off of glass. And it is no different from reflected light off of window glass. If you're going to regulate as a nuisance reflected light off of a solar panel, then you probably better be prepared for regulating reflected light off of windows, because there's a whole lot more of them, and I am waiting, and I'm afraid this is going to happen sooner rather than later, for somebody, some contractor, to sue a city as an arbitrary and capricious regulation because they're regulating glare from a solar panel but not regulating it from a window, because there's no distinguishable difference. And in fact, a window reflects more light than a solar panel because the solar panels have non-reflected glass and windows typically have reflective glass, and they're also oriented in a manner more directly to address you. And I put up this as an example because we are increasingly see cities that are incorporating glare into their solar ordinances and not recognizing that this is something that in a residential neighborhood it's probably not appropriate because there's already lots of glare from glass in a residential neighborhood and you can't really distinguish. It is something that comes into play when you put it out at an airport where there isn't glare. You have empty fields and you're putting a solar panel in them and you have a potential high risk situation with a control tower. That's a situation where glare becomes an issue. It typically is not an issue in a residential neighborhood or even in a commercial area. So just that's my kind of example of how, as we move forward in the kind of understanding of how solar development occurs, how we need to think about the different kinds of nuisances and regulations and how to address them. So I think that's it that I have. There were some of the specific, I did go over your existing ordinance. And I made some notes about it. I will say that the standards that you put in place in regard to the aesthetic standards are some of the more stringent that I've seen in Minnesota. So it is at one end of the spectrum in terms of protecting aesthetic standards as it relates to the appearance of solar as it's on a rooftop. That's not telling you you're right or wrong, but that's where you're at right now in the spectrum of solar development in regard to aesthetics. There are a number of communities that have taken different kinds of perspectives. The city of St. Paul actually developed a set of design standards for advisory standards for people installing solar on rooftops. In their zoning ordinance, they actually have a very permissive zoning ordinance, one that I actually helped them do, and I was a little distressed because I thought it was a little too permissive in terms of what it allowed. But they did, it allows solar to be well off the roof in order to capture the solar resource as high as 3 feet off of the roof and to go up above the peak of the roof. And they have what they call an installation envelope on the roof that they've defined in their ordinance. But they also did do a separate design guideline that kind of reeled that back a little bit, so they know that when a contractor comes up and says, this is what I want to do, they better be looking at those design guidelines because that's what the Planning Commission is going to look at. And I think it's a reasonable approach in kind of recognizing the different standards that communities have at their disposal in order to address aesthetic standards. But the most important thing about aesthetic standards is that you need to define what those standards are so that there's an as-of-right installation pathway for a contractor to go through, rather than have a requirement for a CUP in every case or a design standard review in every case. I know that within some of the homeowner associations, there will be separate design standards that isn't controlled by the city, but those are kind of some of the standards that we really advocate for. So I don't know, do you want to take questions now, or do you want we go through the other presentation?
Planning Commission, what you'd like to do?
I would open up the floor for questions from Mr. Ross. Thank you very much. That was very informative. Questions for the commission for Mr. Ross?
Sure.
Mr. Benke?
Mr. Ross, at the beginning, you talked about the Grow Solar Partnership and it being done. What did you mean by that?
The Grow Solar Partnership was a DOE-funded program that ran for 3 years, and we developed a lot of these materials and provided a great deal of technical assistance directly to cities through that. And unfortunately, we are no longer funded to do that. And so I used to get to come and help people write solar ordinances a lot, and I really don't get to do that anymore.
Where did that funding come from?
Department of Energy.
Okay, and so you're seeing some differences in what the Department of Energy is providing these days?
Yes. Although I will say that there is still ongoing work being done in this field. We actually are just getting ready to start a whole nother program that's being funded by what's ultimately Department of Energy money. It's coming through the National Renewable Energy Lab on coupling solar development with EV infrastructure as a single technology and kind of some of the benefits of that. And we welcome Burnsville participation in that. We'll be launching that program in just a couple of weeks.
Sure. One of the next things you talked about was the different resources. When you're looking at those resources, are aesthetics of a city considered to be a resource?
Yes, they are. Yeah, it is important. Different communities always have different kinds of sensibilities about aesthetics, and we recognize that. I'm an urban planner. I know that aesthetics is something that we've been working on for decades, and there's been a lot of litigation on, and we've defined some standards around. And it is ultimately a community character decision that the community gets to make. We do advocate, however, that there is a consistency as much as possible across jurisdictions, so we have some within the marketplace that we have an equal ability to develop.
Sure, and you were just talking about St. Paul and how their ordinance, you thought it was too permissive, and that would be an example of what you were just talking about.
Right. Yeah.
Where they're allowing essentially built structures to face the sun instead of be integral to the roof and things like that.
Yeah, yes. And it frankly doesn't, in the long run, it doesn't do the solar industry any good to have a whole bunch of really ugly, hideous installations out there.
I really was going to bring an example, but I didn't think I'd need it. I guess I should have, because it would have been exactly what you're talking about. Anyway, under one of the next things I think you talked about, the capture of the rooftop reserve, that number was based on 100% utilization?
What we did was we analyzed where all of where there were existing solar resources, because the map we use and the data set is at a 1 meter resolution, so it's a pretty fine grain. Yeah. And although it is a point in time as well, so it's probably 8 years old now, but nevertheless,
right.
We looked at what were all the economically viable resources, and the entire solar reserve number is 100% utilization of that. Right. Which isn't going to happen.
Well, that's what I was going to ask the next question is, what is realistic for a rooftop installation in a residence, for example?
Yeah. We use the reserve metaphor, if you will, because when we talk about oil reserves, people say there's this many millions of barrels of oil. We're never going to get all of that oil out of the ground. The further down you go in that reserve, the harder it gets and the more expensive it gets to come out, and you'll never fully take care of it. And I think that they'll probably capture it. And the solar reserve is the same way. If we first take all the easy installations, and then the further down we get, we start encountering problems where, well, that particular flat roof looks like it's good, but it's going to require lots of structural modification to it. It's not economically viable because of that, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you, Deb. Yeah, I guess this was the example I was looking at, and it does look like there are a lot of significant opportunities outside of the residential side of the development.
There are.
Is that what you're finding as well?
Yeah, if we were to, and we don't routinely distinguish between the kind of different sizes of buildings, but we do work with some of the folks at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and they do that in the analysis that they do, and they've typically found that in a community, probably the residential portion of the rooftop reserve is probably less than half, and sometimes in some communities it might be as small as a third of the total rooftop reserve. So yeah. And
I'm presuming then that the residential component of the city is significantly over 50% then in that situation. You're basically saying that most cities, like our city, is 66% residential, mm-hmm. and our solar energy production from rooftops of residential might be significantly less than 50%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think then you were talking about the different uses, and while I flagged it, I don't think I gave myself enough information to recall exactly what you're talking about that.
The different types of solar uses?
I think you were talking about it as different uses from a zoning standpoint. It was about in the middle of your discussion.
We do have, maybe it was the point that there are, that solar development takes many forms, and people tend to bundle them all together and treat them all with the same set of
Oh,
standards.
yeah, I think that was it.
Yeah, yeah, and we would say, in our model ordinance, for instance, we segregate out, solar farms from commercial and residential development, and there's a completely different set of standards associated with them. And there's different opportunities also associated with them.
Sure. I guess to take sort of a sidetrack on that, we obviously don't have any open land for solar farms. Don't you consider large rooftop installations to be solar farms too, though?
Under most definitions, they would not, they're not considered. A solar farm is usually something that is a principal use rather than an accessory use.
Okay.
So that's kind of in the land use context, that's the way we would do it.
That's
yeah.
the distinction. Okay, as far as market barriers go then, what kinds of market barriers have you seen that you're trying to actively reduce?
Well, one thing that is relevant to this discussion is that we do want to try to see some consistency across communities
Right.
in terms of the way that they are treating solar development, both in the development regulation and also in the permitting process. One of the things that we have seen, and I'll give this an example as the permitting process, that we have some communities where the building code official wants to require a structural analysis of every single rooftop system that goes up. When in fact they're really on a pitched roof system in Minnesota, there really isn't a need for it if you do a flush mount system. Almost any residential roof can handle that, and in fact, the way the systems are put up nowadays, and we've actually done the structural analysis stamped by a structural engineer to demonstrate this, is that the roof will probably be stronger after the solar installation than beforehand. Because of the rails going across the different structural elements, and if you make sure you're fastening to every single rafter or every single truss rather than just at the corners,
Sure.
you're actually going to make that a stronger roof than before. Because the dead weight of a solar array is only going to be like 3 pounds per square foot.
Yeah, that isn't the issue. We did look into the term flush mount, and we use the term surface mount, mainly because it is on the surface of the roof as opposed to flush to the roof. So
Yes.
we were looking at the definition of flush and we applied that to our building integrated structures.
Okay.
Do you see a big issue in that?
Flush mount is the term the industry uses.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, so that's the one that we have used, and we do try to define it to mean that it allows for a space of up to, and I think your ordinance actually says 12 inches,
Yes.
which was the original amount in our model ordinance that we wrote. We said 12 inches, and we have since lowered that. We actually say 10 inches. But it's
Okay.
it's small change.
Sure. You just talked about that. It's the same thing here. And then you talked about it being a new industry. I did my first solar house in the middle 70s. Why would you call it a new industry then?
It's a new industry because the market has changed so much, and the technology in terms of installation technologies really have dramatically changed.
Sure.
I mean, the kind of installation we were doing back in the 70s, or I was a solar pioneer putting on stuff in 2004 on my home.
Sure.
I was
Sure.
and the kind of things that we were doing then, even in 2004, have changed pretty dramatically. The kind of racking systems we're using, the way we're fastening, the kind of analysis about how you integrate solar into roof structural systems has changed. They're even now in a lot of places allowing designing systems that are sheathing mounted rather than rafter mounted, which I'm still kind of amazes me. But the new industry, there's been enough change that it really has changed the way that we do these things.
Right, except that St. Paul still allows a system that would look like it came out of the 60s where it's an eyesore.
And to their credit, I will say that when they put the design standards in place, they've largely mitigated for the worst of what they would allow in the ordinance. But we recommend again on pitched roof systems in Minnesota that you never do anything other than a flush mount or a surface mount system.
Okay.
Because, and in fact, even the national best practices, when I talk to the people who are doing, my colleagues who are doing work across some of the other states, in almost every state except in those where there are a lot of very shallow pitched roofs, they're also recommending surface or flush mount systems as a routine matter on
Well,
a
I
pitched
think,
roof.
I think generally as the pitches go down, your latitude goes down as well. I mean, if you're in Florida, you have a relatively flat pitch roof, but the sun is much higher in the sky. So you're not really losing anything that way.
Not nearly as much, yeah,
Right.
obviously, as you would here with a shallow roof.
Yeah.
That's correct, yeah.
Right. I think I ran out of paper here.
I got some more. Mr. Bradrick.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. I, actually, when we went through this, the first round one and round two, I did learn a lot from your website and your tool kits, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
You had mentioned that, we talked a little bit about aesthetics, so, anything else in the ordinance that you flagged you, that was the only thing you mentioned?
Well, yeah, I did make a few notes, and I could pull them up and take a look at them, but one of the things that did jump out at me was that you, for ground mount systems, you have a 50% impervious surface assumption that's built into your ordinance, which was what the Pollution Control Agency and their stormwater regulations initially came out with a few years ago, and they no longer use that standard. And I would, we actually recommend for anything that, especially any principal use, be it a small solar garden or something like that, that you adopt the pollinator ground cover standards, which actually usually improves the stormwater management over what was on the site before, and in most cases fully mitigates for the imperviousness of the panel by using the ground underneath as a with deep-rooted plants to basically infiltrate. And most of the modeling that's been done has shown that that is an effective way to address stormwater. So you might want to rethink. I would recommend that you rethink the 50% standard.
Then from the aesthetics comment, us being at the strict end of the continuum, I appreciate that. You made a comparison to St. Paul or Minneapolis. Where are we on in the continuum of what I would consider to be our peer communities? Suburban, Burnsville, Lakeville, Egan. I mean, you may not be quite as aware, but when you look at a suburban community versus an urban community, where are we at in that continuum?
I would say you're still over to one side. We do typically see that communities in the suburban communities are more sensitive to aesthetics than are some of the core cities and even inner tier suburbs. However, most of them address the aesthetic issue by requiring flush mount or surface mount systems whenever there's visibility from the public right of way, to keep it below the peak of the roof. So in terms of visually, you're keeping the architectural integrity of the roof from a visual standpoint whole. And then with more flexibility, if it's on the back side of the roof, if that's what faces south, and you have an opportunity to install on that side. Although even in that case, from a structural standpoint, I say you should be flush mounting even on that side of the roof. But there are also, we have seen a few communities kind of that take a step further beyond that and require additional consideration of visibility in terms of the way that the panels sit on the roof. We have a few homeowner associations. I don't believe any municipalities that I know of, although I can't say that entirely, who have said no solar panels at all on the side of the roof that faces the public right of way. And that would be the most extreme standpoint.
Okay,
And we have seen that with some homeowner associations.
thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Commissioner Singh, thank you, Commissioner Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You piggyback on what Commissioner Bradrick said. We are on the far end of the spectrum. Do you think that's because we try to protect our aesthetics of our community? And if so, should we be looking at that, what we can do to change it, to make it more, I still want to keep the aesthetics, so I'm
Yes,
having the
yes.
difficulty now. But if we look at those conditions and see if we can release the applicants from having to go through all those stringent codes.
Yeah, and I am never going to stand before any community and tell them that they should compromise on the aesthetic standards that they've decided on, is provided they're applying them equally across all different kinds of land uses and the like. There are possibly some things that we could talk about. There might be some visual impact analysis you might be interested in doing on terms of how solar looks in the roof. Deb is already looking at the slides that you put up earlier. You already had done some of that, but there are some ways to do solar that doesn't meet the strict standard that you currently have of matching the shape of the roof with the array, and that is the most difficult piece. And you can still get some things some installations that have reasonable small visual or no visual impact that are designed well into the roof that you could take a look at.
Yes, we spend a lot of time talking about that, and that's what we came up with. And I mean, I'm trying to see if we can probably look at those areas and see if we can go back and discuss them and see if we can make any changes.
Yeah, and I guess obviously the trade-off with the aesthetic is that by having a standard that requires the matching of the roof, you are substantially increasing the cost of the installation, which is not that uncommon to aesthetic standards, right? That frequently is what happens. But obviously then there is a trade-off between people's perceiving that they can't take advantage of their solar resources like the people in, Bloomington can, or something.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Singh. Commissioner Walter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ross, thank you very much. This has been very informative. You obviously work with a lot of communities. Is there one that you would kind of single out as a model community and having cracked the code on this in terms of a process that is supportive of development, doesn't have too many barriers in place, and they're harvesting their reserves without causing all kinds of challenges?
And I'm a little loath. I probably should have boned up on some of the ordinances from surrounding communities before I misstate this. But I do believe that, well, let me say this. I'd be happy to provide you with a couple of examples rather than state them here, and go look at Bloomington's, and then it turns out they don't have one, But and I'm just misremembered. But I have worked with I've worked with dozens. Mm-hmm. I haven't added up, maybe hundreds of communities across the nation and mainly in Minnesota and the 4 states, but to some extent even outside that. So I've seen a lot of stuff, and I got to the point where I can no longer remember who I've worked with and who I haven't. So. But I'd be happy to provide you with some examples of actual ordinances that are in other communities that provide a spectrum of different kinds of aesthetic and kind of reasonableness standards.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there any other questions? You guys have done an excellent job crossing off all of my questions as we've gone down. I guess, Mr. Ross, the only question I would ask is, are there any other communities you work in that are similar or even close to what our aesthetic standard is? I mean, or are we kind of on an island when it comes to that?
I believe, and I say they may have changed their ordinance, but the city of Woodbury used to have a pretty restrictive ordinance. They put it in place probably about the same time that you did yours, a little bit earlier in the development process. I know they've made some changes to that ordinance, so I don't know if it's quite the same in terms of the residential standard, but they did. I believe they had a pretty tough standard on the kind of facing of right-of-way, front of house, and they were also very hard on any kind of a ground mount system that might be in a backyard.
Okay.
So when I say hard, I mean restrictive.
Yep.
There were, and that has been where most of the conflict I have in the last 2 years that I've seen has been around ground mount systems rather than rooftop systems. People tend to be more accepting today of rooftop systems, particularly as we've seen substantial amounts of evidence that, in fact, all of the studies that have been done about the impact of solar on property values has shown that a solar panel on a home does not affect in any way the property value of the home next door. And the solar panel on that home will actually increase the property value at the point of sale. And as more of that evidence comes out, people tend to be a little bit more accepting of how that kind of development happens. There's still a lot of pushback, like I said, about ground mount systems.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Benke?
would that hold true with your comment about the St. Paul installations that remind us of the 60s?
Yeah,
In your opinion, of course.
And I believe, it is my personal opinion, although we don't have enough of those kinds of studies to do a proper statistical analysis to identify that, but it is my humble opinion that such an installation would in fact detract from the property value of at least the home that it's on.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? No other questions. Thank you very much. That
Thank
was
you.
a wealth of knowledge. Our next presenter is, I don't have a name, but
Brian Allen.
Right now,
Brian,
I'm lucky enough to share the same name as the last presenter, Brian Rosso.
are you?
Yes, I'm Brian Allen.
Oh, Brian Allen.
Yeah,
Thanks for
not
coming
the same
tonight.
last name. While Deb gets this put up, thank you all for allowing me to have an opportunity to come and speak with you. I know last year when you were reviewing your solar ordinance, I kind of spoke up at the end, waved my arms, was hoping to get a chance to speak. So this year I'm up here, so I appreciate that. I'll do a quick intro and then I'm going to just jump through this. Brian really touched on a lot of the things that I think I would like to also touch on, but I'm going to provide you with concrete examples of projects that we've submitted for review through your planning commission. All Energy Solar, we're a building and electrical contractor here in Minnesota. We also operate out of Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, and New Hampshire. We've grown over the years. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. We've done over 1,700 solar installations across all of our markets. This year alone, we'll probably do another 800 projects throughout all of the territories that we operate in. You can go ahead and switch to the next slide. The purpose, there's a couple things that I really want to talk to you about, and I think they've already been touched on. That's the aesthetic requirements that we've experienced with the city of Burnsville. And you know, I guess that I can speak to a lot of the questions that you had given to Brian Ross in reference to market barriers, different cities, St. Paul being a good one. Our office is actually located in St. Paul. We've got over 175 installations in the city of St. Paul, and I would say wholeheartedly that none of them are the scary 1970s design. We care about aesthetics. Our customers care about aesthetics, and just like you do as well. So I'll move on from there. I won't rant too much. You can go ahead and hit up the next slide there. So I did want to point this out. We've got some standards in the industry. Brian mentioned it, that the costs have come down to the point where the levelized cost of solar energy is pretty much on par with the levelized cost of electricity you get from a utility company these days. And there's financing models out there where we can turn around and install a system on your home, and you don't have to pay for it up front, pay for it over time, and it's the same, you're saving the same amount that you're spending on your loan. So it's a bill swap. Instead of paying the utility, pay for your solar panels. And they produce all the energy that your home needs, if you're able to fit that many panels on your home. So what we have are just a couple standard size solar panels in this slide. We're just showing you that, look, this is what we buy today. This is what the industry has come to accept as far as a pretty much standardized solar panel dimension. And this is what we purchase on a regular basis. So you can go ahead and hit the next slide. In fact, go to the next one as well. All right, so these are some problematic reasons for your ordinance that we see on a consistent basis. We've actively stopped marketing, spending any type of marketing dollars on any Burnsville leads that we get because of the issues that we see. And so we actively market everywhere else in the state of Minnesota, and the main reason I think will come towards the end of my presentation, but we'll go from there. So the uncertainty of the project viability, you can go ahead and hit the next slide. This is an example of a project that we submitted to your planning commission here. The customer initially told us, they said, look, we want to maximize our investment in this solar project and try to produce the amount of energy that our home needs. And so the design on the left was the one that we showed them, and we said, this is going to go through the city of Burnsville, it's not going to be allowed. And they said, well, let's submit it anyways and see what they say. We did. We then were told it wasn't allowed based on your ordinance, that we needed to make some adjustments. We offered version number 2. Again, this was not allowed based on your ordinances and your review process. We finally offered number 3. Again, this was not allowed. At this point, the only option was to go through a conditional use permit process. The customer didn't want to pursue that any further. They were concerned that they wouldn't receive approval, so they canceled the project, and we charged them for the time and effort that we put in towards getting to at least this point. You can go to the next slide. Inconsistency in the interpretation of the ordinance based on who the reviewer is. You can go to the next slide, please. So this is an example of a project where we submitted an initial plan review. The one on the far right was approved, and there was some additional changes the customer made to their rooftop. They added SIP panels, which actually increased the roof height and actually created some changes around the valleys on that attachment to the south of the home, resulting in us being able to make some adjustments in the actual layout. So the middle option was then submitted, and this was not approved. And I have a hard time deciphering which one is different in aesthetic terminology. And so one of them was approved, and then it wasn't. So you can go ahead and do the next slide, please. This is where I want to talk about the discrimination that we see with homeowners that have hip roofs. You've got a hip roof, you're going to have a really hard time doing solar in the city of Burnsville. You can go ahead and hit the next slide. So the design on the left was an approved project. This customer got lucky. They've got a rectangular shaped roof. They have a couple roof vents, so we had to avoid those. But ultimately, they were able to put solar on their home. The design on the right, this is an actual home in Burnsville. We didn't install the project. It was installed by another contractor who, I think you guys all know the project. We tried offering some solutions that we thought might fit the current ordinance. This wasn't allowed, and it resulted in, I think, a pretty upset person and process driven issue, simply because of the hipped roofs. You can go on to the next slide, please. Brian mentioned it towards the end. When we encourage or enforce more stringent aesthetic requirements, it does increase the cost of a project. The example I'm giving here is the fact that I now have 2 solar arrays on this one roof surface. The version on the left was not allowed, the version on the right was. We did install the system on the right, and this was actually one of our very first permits that I think was submitted right after your ordinance was approved. When we split an array like this, we ultimately have to connect the wiring from the array on the left with the array on the right. We don't like running conduit or wires right across the roof, so we often go into the roof to gain access to the attic space and run internal conduit to the other array. That adds time and materials. So as a company standard, we charge $250 to split an array. And so this system resulted in a $250 change order for the customer, and that adds cost. So next slide, please. You know what? Every CUP process is lengthy, so we can go ahead and skip to the next slide and the one following that as well. All right, so what I wanted to display here was just, in reference to maybe one of the first statements we made, was just the uncertainty around whether or not we're going to be able to do a project on a roof. My permitting liaison, it's her job to go through and permit every single project. She knows a lot of jurisdictions throughout Minnesota. And we don't have the same type of restrictions that we have here in Burnsville and in any other of the jurisdictions that we've done solar with. But she went ahead and just did some snapshots of some neighborhoods in Burnsville, and she really just wanted to point out the fact that a lot of these roofs, if we tried to put solar on them, we would run into issues with the planning and reviewing process. Next slide, please. Here's another neighborhood where we would run into a number of issues. 27% of this neighborhood has issues with the current design of a system. Next slide, please. Another section where 44% of the homes. You can go to the next slide as well. This one, 26% of those homes. And next slide. This one's another 46%. And so these are just small Google Earth snapshots, and we circled homes. You can go to the next slide. And then this is the final piece that I just wanted to touch on. And it stems from the fact that hipped roofs make a great place for solar. A lot of people have them. But there's a requirement on your end that the customer utilize or maintain the same shape as that roof. And so there's a triangular panel requirement, or faux panel as we've been told. Basically, make a fake panel that's triangular shaped to try and maintain the roof surface. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So I just gave an example here. I just made a simple drawing. What you have is the array on the top left would be a conforming array within your jurisdiction. The array on the right, I would have to custom make two different triangular shaped modules to meet that rectangular shaped roof. The array on the bottom left wouldn't actually comply because you require all the panels to be orientated in the same orientation within an array. And the array on the bottom right, I have to custom make a triangular shaped panel to try and fit those sections. I can't go out and buy a custom or a custom made triangular shaped panel. I reached out to all my panel suppliers and asked them, would you make one if I asked? And they said no. So that's the majority of the panel manufacturers that we work with, and we work with a lot of them. But they just don't find any value in doing so. And I think it's the biggest hindrance that we face with your community and with your planning process. I really appreciate you giving me the chance to come up here and complain to you about your process. I don't mean to do it in a way that insults or does anything along those lines. I appreciate the fact that you have an ordinance. Not every city does. And we spend a lot of our time sending the toolkit that Brian and the Great Plains Institute put together to a lot of cities and jurisdictions to try and help them create their own. We experience solar moratoriums. We do all of this. We're installing solar all across the state. We're looking for opportunities to build solar systems within communities, and this is one of the hardest ones to do that in. And so I just wanted to express that, and thank you for the time to come up and present. So.
Thank you, Brian. That was very informative to get your boots on the ground perspective. Are there any questions for Brian Allen from the commission?
Sure.
Commissioner Benke.
Deb, can we go back to the start of his PowerPoint? And by the way, what was just up there? Was that something different, or was that something?
There were additional pictures that were included.
Okay.
I didn't know if
Well,
those
what were
were
those
part
then?
of.
Yeah,
the
so
presentation.
that was examples of triangular shaped panels that we found online. Now, Sharp used to make a triangular shaped module, but in order for it to really work, the solar panel itself needed to be square. One of the first slides I showed you was kind of our standard solar module
Right,
sizes.
I was coming back to that too.
Yeah.
And Deb, I think that was the brand I think that you may have originally come up with in our original view of the product.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, could you, go back to the beginning, I guess, then?
Okay.
Yeah, okay, I want to come back to this page down the road a little bit, but can we go into like 3 pages now, I think? You talked about 750 projects, and I guess I was curious, do they all use just this one panel type, or how many of them are built, what we would call building integrated according to our ordinance? Where you're actually incorporating them into the structure of the building?
Yep, so 1,750 so far. 2 systems had solar shingles that were by a company called IPV, Integrated Photovoltaics.
Okay.
It was just a 4-foot long by about 2-foot tall solar shingle that you could connect, and it could replace the existing roof surface. We did
Sure.
2 of those, one of them in our Massachusetts office and then one in Iowa.
And can you talk a little bit about why you might think that that's the case? I mean,
Cost.
why did those 2 go in? Just because of cost?
Yeah, I mean, we have our standard solar module sizes. These are far less expensive. Also efficiency. Brian mentioned flush mounted being elevated off the roof, we get airflow beneath the modules. It reduces heat. Heat is a restrictive agent when it comes to electricity, so we're trying to reduce the amount of resistance, and so we want the panels to be cooler. As soon as you place a solar shingle directly on a roof surface, it traps that heat within it, and it's a little bit less efficient. We're also taking up more square footage with less energy output with a solar shingle. So it really is an aesthetic component, not a cost-saving component.
I guess the building integrated that I'd seen, they actually replaces the sheathing in some cases so that you actually don't have a problem with the heat buildup because you're actually exposing it to the attic air underneath, and that's a ventilated space.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you.
Sure.
If I had
Sure.
seen that product, I might look at that.
Sure.
But we've had a really hard time selling solar shingles. We tried. And it's the cost to buy the product has always been the issue. They aren't mass marketed or mass manufactured, and as a result, the cost per watt to purchase that solar shingle is much higher than a standard solar module that I can buy. So,
But the panels that you're buying are pretty much covered by the tax rebates and other aspects of the financing that you can provide. How is that different for the solar shingles?
it's just they're a higher price up front. So for the panels themselves, if I have to spend $1.50 a watt for a solar shingle, but I can spend 60 cents a watt for a standard panel, it's a no-brainer.
So it's a return on investment side of it. I mean,
Absolutely.
You're still, I mean, it's still a wash in terms of what the buyer sees. It's just a longer payback.
Yeah, and the amount of energy you can generate from a solar shingle on a roof versus a solar panel, you're going to have a much higher kilowatt hour per kilowatt on a solar panel than you are on a solar shingle. So you might take up the same amount of space for a solar shingle system, but you're going to have a smaller energy system, therefore producing less energy, and you're going to spend more on that than you would on just putting solar panels up. And so that's been the biggest crux is you can't fit enough, you can't produce enough, and it's way more expensive.
I guess I saw the geometry of the smaller shapes to allow you to cover more of the roof than these larger panels. But I guess that would depend on each installation. Okay, Deb, can I see the next? Oh, yeah. I'm certainly amenable to what you're talking about with the complex roofs, that's for sure. I'm very bothered by the inconsistency of interpretation. I do think that that's very clear that there's an issue there. I think what I was just talking about with the hip roofs, I think that, again, that might be a function of the product that you have as opposed to a different product. I guess I had a couple of questions about installation when we get to that. The COP, like, okay, and comply. Okay, yeah, why don't we go to one of the installations if you could, Deb? So I guess the only thing I can see here is you've got a significant void around a vent on the roof. I'm presuming that's what is in the horseshoe on the two not allowed. If you're gonna go in the roof and spend $250 to, well, I'm sorry. Yeah, because you're gonna see that on the one on the right here. If you're gonna go in the roof and spend $250 on plumbing a conduit, why wouldn't you move the vent to where you can connect them?
We do often move vents.
Okay.
Sometimes those vents aren't movable.
True. I realize that.
Yeah.
I mean,
But yeah, every opportunity we get to do that, we will propose that.
Okay.
That's more time and effort, and so when we do look at homes and provide customers with this layout, all of our customers prior to us submitting for permitting and moving forward with that aspect of it,
Sure.
get to look at what we've designed. So we do a 3D model of the home, make it look pretty, and send it to them and say, this is what those panels are going to look like on your home.
Sure. I guess the middle one here, it looks like you could actually get 2 additional panels by moving a vent. So
Yeah.
that is something that's talked about and discussed, and it is
Absolutely.
something that's part of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Deb, why don't we move forward a little bit? Yeah, this one.
So you can see on that one,
Yeah.
the orange blocks were vents that were moved in
right.
order to make space for the modules.
Yeah, and I guess I'm a little curious about the two comments you made about the right one and the middle one here.
From a staff perspective, we don't agree with the applicant.
Oh.
And we didn't go into the detail of exactly what the parameters are for these.
Okay.
If you'd like us to in the future, we can do that.
Yeah,
Because
I-
there are other considerations that have not been presented to you.
I think, Deb, I think the goal here might be to help you guys with more tools.
Exactly.
So, okay. Next one. Yeah, I think that's more of the same. Okay. Can I go back to the first slide again, please? Thank you. So we see two different kinds of panels here?
Yeah.
And these are typical for what you're doing? Or is there, I mean, how many different panel types do you supply?
Well, it depends on the time of the year, but in general, we offer at any given period of time anywhere from 4 to 6 different solar modules that we let our salespeople sell.
Okay.
And then that depends on the availability in the market.
Okay.
You know, as an example, I had about 900 modules from last year that we weren't able to finish, that we carried over to this year. We went to purchase the modules, they're not available.
Sure.
So we had to switch brands, had to even switch wattage, which resulted in change orders, et cetera. But, and different dimensions of the solar panel. They were different by a matter of, you know, a half an inch one direction, half an inch another direction, but still the standard 60 cell size panel, so.
Sure. I guess my concern with these images, and it really isn't represented that I've seen in any of the documentation you've given, is that while the panels are dark, all of the framing is raw aluminum. And is there any opportunity to have architectural bronze or stuff that is more color matched? Most of the roofs you're going on are dark, I'm assuming?
Yeah, so your standard solar module is going to have a white backsheet, which you can see on the back side of the cells there. So the spots where you see the diamonds, that's your
Okay.
white backsheet, is going to have an anodized aluminum frame.
Okay.
Cost comes into play as soon as we start to say, let's get a black backsheet with a black frame. They also make a black frame with a white backsheet. So those are your 3 different styles
Sure.
that we can get. Not every manufacturer makes a black frame, black backsheet. Most manufacturers make a white with silver and a white with black frame. And so it depends on the manufacturer. We sell a lot of LG solar modules, and LG being, you know, life's good, they make a lot of electronics. They make a black on black solar panel. And so, but it is a,
How do you characterize the difference in price?
it is more expensive, because they,
10%, 80%?
I would have to, look, yeah. It'd be a difference of, I could buy them for 60 cents with a silver frame, and I could buy them for 70 cents with a black frame, so.
Okay. Okay. Do you consider the $250 charge to connect the panels to be excessive?
Some cases, yes. In other cases, no. It depends on the roof's, the attic access. If there's no attic access, we're running conduit over the roof, and I can be a little bit faster in doing that. It's the equipment that we use to get into the roof. So I've got $120 alone just in a flashed box that is low enough to fit underneath the modules.
Sure.
So you don't see any wires.
Sure.
So I got $120 in equipment right there.
Sure.
So.
Okay. I think that's all I got for right now.
Commissioner, excuse me, Commissioner Benke, is there any other questions for Mr. Allen? Commissioner Walter?
I just have a comment. I want to just thank you for coming and offering this perspective. It's very, it's very helpful. We obviously have a lot to consider, but it's nice to get the, you know, the feedback and this information, so I appreciate it.
Oh, I'm sorry, I do have one more question.
The
Sorry.
floor is yours. Are you done?
I'm done, yeah. It's not really a question. I'm always quick.
Just curious what your opinion of Tesla and SolarWall is going to do to your industry.
All Energy Solar is a certified installer of the Tesla Powerwall.
Okay.
I don't know of any other people in Minnesota that are certified to do so, but I know they're actively seeking them out.
Yeah.
we've installed this year alone. Last year we sold around 40 of them. We've already doubled that in sales. They're not the easiest thing in the world to install. Electrically speaking, it's a complicated electrical system, but they are becoming more and more popular. So
Is that the Powerwall or Powerwall 2?
Powerwall 2 AC version.
Okay, and then have you seen anything yet on his shingles?
We have been told that they will not be subcontracting the installation of solar shingles. So it's only going to be made available to customers when Solar City, who Tesla purchased a couple years ago or last year, is active in that market.
Okay,
So.
thank you.
Any other questions, Commissioner Bertrick?
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate all your information. And for full disclosure, last year when Brian was kind of frustrated with us and left the meeting, I did reach out to him. He educated me on a few pieces here. So it's sad to hear you're not spending any marketing money in the city of Burnsville, and I understand that. To kind of, I always try to get things kind of nutted down, and so you have some concerns. One, I think the piece everybody needs to understand, part of your panels, I don't know if they are still today, you said a couple of your manufacturers are Minnesota-based? They might have been and not anymore?
They were.
Okay,
The legislation passed law last year that eliminated about $100 million in solar rebates through the Made in Minnesota solar program. So we no longer have Minnesota-made solar manufacturers. They've all either gone bankrupt, 10K and Silicon Energy, or have chosen not to manufacture in the state anymore. iTech and Haleen were manufacturers that had manufacturing elsewhere. So. Yeah.
part of the piece was that they were made in Minnesota, so there was less cost in transportation and getting standard panels here,
Yeah.
which brought the cost down. Really, so your concern, as we continue to look at our policy, is how our restrictions on the arrays, and what we require to be split or not split, because I do know, I think you and I talked about, there's a simple math number against moving a plumbing pipe versus the cost of a panel and the payback of adding that panel. That's a pretty down-to-earth, simple math number. And then that gets to whether you avoid a roof barrier or if you move that roof barrier.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming. I appreciate you coming to 2 meetings. And
I'll keep coming.
we always, on this side of the desk, always get, information from people that come and talk to us, and then we also have to work with the information that staff gets us. And then we have to try to come up with something that works well for the community. So I do appreciate coming in. I appreciate you bringing us the data you did today. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Commissioner Brackey?
And I know I didn't do it, but I do want to thank you two both. I mean, sometimes I come across like all I'm after is answers, and I get sort of focused on that. But I do enjoy this discussion. Like I said, I've been in this industry since the middle '70s, and I've seen it grow. And I just think with everything that's going on out there, it has a lot of potential, that's for sure. It always has. It's just, why has it taken 45 years to get there? Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Allen? No other questions? I just have one quick follow-up question. And this isn't, you don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but what would get you back to Burnsville? What could bring your company back here?
Yeah, I would say the first thing would be the restriction or the requirement that you try to follow the shape of a roof, or at least the interpretation of that as being that you need to include a triangular shaped module. Guys, I can't get them, and so because of that, I avoid you guys. I avoid the city. When we get leads in for Burnsville, we overqualify them and try to push them off. As we don't want to even try to deal with it, because it's a restrictive process. We know the ordinance, we understand it, And so, yeah, triangular panels, and then also the fact that I can't have panels orientated in multiple different ways, landscape with portrait. We have a lot of different shapes of roofs, and we try to puzzle piece solar panels into that existing roof space to try to maximize the potential output of that roof with solar energy. And that's our biggest objective. How can we maximize this space? We also have to take aesthetics into consideration in doing so, because 70% of our installs have been referral business. So, if we were doing poorly designed or not aesthetically pleasing arrays, we'd have a lot less business, I think. And so we still take that into consideration, but yeah, I think aesthetics is in the eye of the beholder too, so.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you all, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We have one more speaker tonight. It would be David Kuchar, 1400 West 149th Street, Burnsville. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, Council, Planning Commission. Thank you as well for coming here, Mr. Ross, and also Brian. Who am I? Why am I here? Actually, I have a bit of a history with Great Plains Institute. I used to actually be their IT person prior with a company that had dissolved prior to Twin Cities Computing, which I started 2.5 years ago. I also prior had got interest in sustainability and renewable energy technologies while working on site at Great Plains Institute. That's what helped really push me to decide to install solar on my home here in Burnsville that I've been a resident for 15 years in this community. Year after year, when I would take the bus at the transit station, I would see that there was a solar array, and I would dream of the day that I could afford a home here in this city and be able to afford the ability to try to put on solar and make a net zero home and see if that was a reality. I started that mission 2 years ago. With that mission, I went ahead and I started contacting different solar contractors. One of the first solar contractors that I did consult with was All Energy Solar. I actually consulted with them first. I started calling around about 2 years ago at this time, and I was told that Burnsville had quite a restrictive ordinance. There appears here, Ms. Garros had just mentioned that ordinance went into effect March 8th of 2016. During that time in that discussion with All Energy Solar, and after my interest in pursuing solar, working for Great Plains Institute, I decided to pursue that venture. I spoke to a couple different solar contractors. After, again, All Energy Solar, another solar contractor promised that they could install sooner, quicker, faster, and promised me the world. As a homeowner, that was my dream. So I took upon that dream and I sent in $16,000 to that contractor for the equipment in return for a solar array. What happened after that application process that went in was the solar array began work. The installer, Akvo Sunworks, for this previous installer, started working on the process, putting up the rails and the solar panels. And what happened was the city came back and said it's a hip roof, and because of the aesthetics ordinance, it won't comply. That then began my journey to on-sale proof my home and to apply for a conditional use permit. I then took it upon myself to even go to the Planning Commission on June 7th in front of the mayor and see if I could even run in the Planning Commission to help make a difference. Then I went and pursued a conditional use permit as I was instructed by the mayor and by the City Council and Planning Commission. I spent $1,750. I couldn't buy a lawnmower that year, but I could buy a 6-month permit for consideration for solar on my property. The only way to get that to happen is to get the electrician to come out and give the final approval. And in agreements with what Great Plains Institute and All Energy Solar has mentioned, the solar industry has changed rapidly overnight. What has happened is currently in my array, I even have microinverters. So they don't go down to a central panel, they can actually make electricity individual at each panel. And then they're held together at a junction box. I've currently signed agreements with Dakota Electric as a QF, or qualifying facility. I'm classified as a small power production facility. I produce, again, since it was passed in 1982, net metering. I produce energy for the city of Burnsville through Dakota Electric and my community. Since install, which was about a year ago, I've produced 7.5 megawatts of power. 2/3 of my home's power has been reduced. And again, factoring that out has been in regards to possible snow coverage over the winter months is what I've projected that to. Since trying to work with all of the city's guidance processes, I've tried to meet the aesthetics based symmetry, which can be achieved, in my opinion, without triangular modules. I've looked far and wide. I have all ends of the earth, and what I can see is that there was previous installations that took place in this community probably about almost a decade ago. That company, again, which was reiterated by Ms. Garros, was a company called Sharp, and they, as we know, made VCRs and DVD players and different things like that. They also made solar products, and they made a triangular module. And as All Energy Solar has mentioned, the reason why that went away in the market is, again, efficiency and cost. It didn't make sense. So what was brought to my attention at the last meeting was, let's Google this. Well, if we Google this now, I will show up on Quora, I will show up on the internet, that I have searched all ends of the internet. That product from Sharp was discontinued 10 years ago. There are no triangular solar modules in the marketplace. There is no way to comply. I have been told by Chris Forsland that I need to make faux corner pieces. And no one's told me anything. I've even contacted the manufacturer. I've been sued multiple times. I'm sale-proofed on my home. I'm told that I'm considered illegal. It's a misdemeanor.
Excuse
I'm
me, Mr.
hoping-
Chair. I'm sorry, Mr. Kuchar, the purpose of this tonight is to not go through your specific case. The purpose is to talk about the ordinance itself, so if you could confine your comments to that, that would be most helpful. Thank you.
I would reiterate what Deb said, just stick to the ordinance.
Because of the ordinance being very restrictive, I've had a 2-year journey to try to pursue that dream of solar that I started many years ago with the individual sitting behind me with multiple different organizations. My intent, in good faith, was to be a resident, work with a contractor and get this installed. But because of the way this is interpreted, I'm having a difficulty to make my array compliant. I do feel that the CUP does ensure that the permit reflects industry best practices, but in Burnsville, we're not doing that. I also feel that aesthetics are based on symmetry, which can be achieved without triangular modules. I appreciate the Planning Commission approving that CUP process and allowing me to at least get a year's worth of data on this and see if this could be viable. And along with the data that we've received from All Energy Solar and from Great Plains Institute, I feel that if we make a slight modification to this ordinance on aesthetics, I feel like that many other homeowners like myself can have that dream as well. And I appreciate your time for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kuchar. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Kuchar?
Mr. Chair, just one.
Commissioner Benke?
Mr. Kutcher, I'm presuming that the image that Brian Allen had shown, that was pretty clearly your house, with the detached garage and the rectangular arrays on both, that would be something that you'd feel comfortable with installing or modifying your installation to if that allowed you to comply?
I'm sorry, could you reword that?
Well, I guess Deb's not here to put the picture up again. The picture that we saw was of the hip, I'm sorry, Deb. It was of a hip roof and detached garage, and there were 2 arrays that were essentially rectangular. Very simple, very clean. And I was trying to see if that is the type of installation you were trying to achieve. I think it's right. I think you passed it. Yeah, it's right there. No, I'm sorry, up one more. Right, that one, right, nope, up,
Oh, here we go.
there. The one on the right here.
Yes, that has been always the goal. One of the biggest things that I agree with and with Burnsville is that we do care about aesthetics, and that does matter. And I believe 100% it does matter. And we have to blend that with nature and technology. I know that's not easy, and I know that's where we're at in this industry right now. And all I'm just asking is for us to take a careful look at this. Take a careful look and see. But yes, that is correct, Mr. Benke.
Yeah.
That was what I'm hoping for would be approved and not allowed.
And allowed. right?
And allowed, yes.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Kuchar? No other questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your
speaking
time.
to this
Thank you
tonight.
very much.
Okay, so we've heard from 3 individuals regarding our solar ordinance tonight, and we have a discussion in front of us with instruction to give staff on if we want to change, update, modify our solar ordinance. So I would open up discussion to anybody that wants to go first about reacting to what we just heard this evening. Commissioner Walter.
I'll go first. Thank you to everybody who's, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to everyone who's been here for this discussion tonight. I've learned a lot. I think I'm the newest member of this group, so I haven't been here through quite as many steps. You know, I know we just all went through the comprehensive plan process, and I know one of our goals and aspirations has always been to be a friendly community for business, to make that process easy, and so forth. I'd like to see us be the same in this area. I think it is a good, as everyone has observed, this is an area that has evolved quickly. I think you've got a lot of people that are going to be looking for options like solar on their homes, and I think we definitely need to go back and revisit this ordinance. I'd like to make the process change it in such a way that we're not getting the feedback that we've gotten tonight, that we're on one of the extreme ends of how this is regulated from a city perspective. So I'll just open it with that tone. I don't have any real specifics at this point. I think they've been outlined, but I definitely would be in support of revisiting the ordinance.
Thank you, Commissioner Walter. Commissioner Singh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have heard quite a lot tonight from 3 speakers. And in my opinion, I think we need some time to digest what they have said. We have to go back into our ordinance and look at the possibility of making changes. I mean, Mr. Allen said that they don't do any business in Minnesota. In Burnsville, because we are too restrictive. Now, you know, that's not something that we really like. We don't like that. We did our comprehensive plan, as Commissioner just said, and we want Burnsville to be friendly for homeowners, business owners, and if we can do something to mitigate these restrictions, I think we need to consider that very seriously. What we have heard tonight, I mean, for me, I'm speaking for myself, I need to consider it. I need to go back and look at what we have and see if we can make changes that would keep our aesthetics, at the same time make it more friendly for homeowners and business owners. Mr. Chair, I don't know if it's possible that we can table this for the next meeting. And
No, there's no action item needed on
It's
this.
not an action item, yeah.
well,
we could
never mind. It's not an action.
Yeah.
It's not an action. but-
Staff is asking for direction if we choose, but we don't have to. So I don't think we would need to act on this
Mr.
tonight.
Chair, I think we need to consider this seriously. In my opinion tonight, having listened to what the speaker said, I need to put that together, and I need to go back and look at what we have, and see if if we need to make changes. I'm not saying we have to. If we need to make changes. Right now, I'm so full of the information I received, and then I don't have the time to look at the ordinance and see what we have. If your staff is going to advise us, if we can, come back next meeting and we will be more prepared.
It's up to the planning commission. However, tonight, we specifically have set up these discussions to try to get information. I would also let you know that we do have other installers that have not had issues making solar installations, and you've not heard from them. This is not the only contractor. So just so that you know, what we tried to do is to give you the parameters. And from a staff standpoint, we concur with what's been said, is that really it's that shape and proportion of the roof that is the difficulty.
That's the hip roof.
Shape and proportion of the roof, period. You have to,
period.
the solar array needs to meet that. And that's where we get into difficulty with hip roofs or anything, anything that's somewhat similar to that. So I guess we would seek whatever direction Planning Commission has, because otherwise we'll just come back and say, okay, next time we'll open it up for discussion,
Yep.
without any other information for you.
Mr. Chair?
I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Menke.
I think maybe I can help here a little bit. Ram, I agree. I agree with your point exactly. There's been a lot of information here. There's a lot that we are trying to digest, absolutely. And I'm saying that too. And, I'm in the industry, not to his level, but I'm still in the industry. And yet I totally see what Commissioner Walter is saying as well. There's an issue here that we need to look at. What Deb just mentioned brings a whole nother aspect to it. Personally, what I'd like to do is to give Deb direction to provide us with some of that other information that she just mentioned. For example, what other applications are coming in? What are the results of those installations? How are they being looked at? Is there a lot of work being done by building department to try to make them comply, or are they coming in real clean? And he's not doing, Chris is not doing a lot of work on them. I think that, there's obviously aspects here of just available product, which I get that, like we said, the industry changed. I think there's other aspects of aesthetics that we would like to talk more about. For example, how well does it blend into the roof? How visible are they? If the roof is black and the panels are white, just for sake of argument, they're gonna stick out like a sore thumb. I think we still have to look at our goals here and what we're after from an aesthetic component. So, I do think that there's probably something that we need to work on here in terms of changes, but I couldn't come to a conclusion right now, and you know how vocal I can be about things, so.
Commissioner Bradrick.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think we were actually looking to, as we said, this wasn't an actual action-oriented meeting this evening, so it is on our 2018 work plan. So we do have a fair amount of time to do this, and I agree that we've done this in the past. We've done this several times where because we, the people at this desk, are responsible for the ordinance that's in front of us today. And no different than many other ordinances we've had, we've asked to look at it a year and then another year. And, I think it's feasible. I would like to see, as Commissioner Benke said, just kind of a lack of a better term, an autopsy of the applicants that the city has received in the last, since we enacted this ordinance. And then I'd like some, total number of permits and permits that didn't pass, to get at some numbers. And I do think we need to address the concerns that I kind of outlined from Mr. Allen's speech. But I, Chair, would suggest that that's kind of where we start. We would look at every application. I might be very interested to have Chris Forsland come in and give us a piece of what his side of the application process has been. Good, bad, or
Actually, from
indifferent.
the, Chris Forsland.
Chris wouldn't be, because
the
that was a code enforcement. It
Yeah,
would be-
as far as our building inspections, we have a straight permit. They rarely comment or have issues, you may need an electrical permit, but that's very straightforward. So really, the issues come into play with what we've discussed tonight with this shape and proportion and how that's interpreted or how it's met and that type of a thing.
And then lastly, I'd like I'm certainly not looking for, because I have a tendency to ask for the wrong thing sometimes, but I'd be interested in a couple of spot checks, and maybe Mr. Ross can provide those, but like communities, from a standpoint of what does Apple Valley, Lakeville, Egan, Savage, Bloomington, what is the difference between the code that we enacted and what our neighboring
cities are.
communities are? And that's, would be my suggestion, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Bridger. I had Deb refer, Commissioner, thank you.
Thank you. And I would be interested in anybody else that is restrictive and how they relate to our restrictions.
Woodbury.
Well, potentially, but there may be another as well. I mean, I'm just looking, you know, if we're gonna look at, the market cities, that's great, but if there's an outlier near us, how do we match up against it? What are they doing different? Why is it an outlier? Where are the faults with it? What can we learn from that?
Is there any other comments or questions? Before we even started, Deb, I had written down some questions, and Commissioner Bradrick kind of touched on these, but I'd be curious to know, I think we've kind of established what's proven to be the biggest source of frustration here. How many applications were submitted and how many were approved versus turned away? You know, what's our ratio of rubber stamping versus not meeting the code? And then how many applications have been issued without any trouble at all? How many have just gone right through? And those are kind of my two main pieces that I'd be interested in from a staff perspective.
I can quickly address that. The ones that have gone through are the ones that don't have angled roofs, like a hip roof or, you know, something coming in. If they're just, you know, a rectangle and they don't have any problems. So those go right through. The problem ones are the ones that have been brought up tonight, really.
Deb, can we go look at a couple of the neighborhood pictures that were provided by Mr. Allen? Yeah, and I may want to ask him one more question about that. Aren't they down? Oh, I'm sorry.
Down here.
Yeah. Mr. Allen, I know that on this you said that the ones in red, I presume you mean that the ones in red are the ones that would not meet the standards you're looking for an installation?
I guess,
I mean, that's the intent of the image. I'm not.
yeah, the
I'm not
intent
trying
is to say those ones probably have enough hip roofs to disqualify them from us even trying to attempt to sell them solar. You know, we can't
Well, I guess.
pick all of our customers, so whatever roof they have is what we have to work with, so.
Right, but I'm looking at the three toward the bottom off of Rushmore Drive. The left one appears from this image anyway to be a gable roof, and so does the next one for that matter. But they're both, I'm trying to understand, you know, sort of how you came to it. I mean, if we look up toward the cul-de-sac off of Rushmore up near where it says 238, you know, clearly where you have a hip roof at a 45-degree angle, I mean, you wouldn't be really able to put much on there even if you were putting rectangular panels on it, right? I mean, that one in particular, I know I'm maybe putting you on the spot a little bit, but there are I guess what I'm getting to is there are roofs that simply won't work. And it really isn't necessarily a matter of whether it's hip or gable.
Yeah, I'm, not every roof is suitable for solar,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, I guess this stuck with me a little bit with what we were just talking about, and especially with what Deb just mentioned, so, okay.
Yeah, I would say there's a significant portion of your building stock that has hip roofs. And so, like Deb mentioned, as soon as it's a hipped roof, we're, you know, avoiding it.
Right,
So,
okay.
Even if it does have space and would be a good roof for solar.
No, I realize that, but that's a different part of what I was talking about. And I guess really what I was trying to get to with that is that, you know, there are gonna be easy solutions and then there are gonna be hard solutions. And I think, perhaps we may wanna look harder at the hard solutions and what can make a solution work. And then we also probably have to say at some point, we can't help it. It's just not gonna fly. So, thank you.
Remember, sometimes we ask for stuff that isn't necessarily attainable.
Yep.
You
Right.
have to, staff will have to use your best judgment on
Absolutely.
how you can get to the intent of what we're asking for versus staff time and expenses.
Yep.
We can, I think, based on the general comments tonight, that gives us some direction to go and do some further study and put some information together. Brian Ross has, some ideas and things, and we did include with the comprehensive plan, the solar map is included in our comprehensive plan, and there may be some elements of that could further help us out as well, so
Thank you.
we'd bring this back for a future discussion. I don't know that we'd have everything ready for your next meeting.
No, they don't have to bring it to the next meeting.
It's a work plan item, so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
We'll try to keep it,
as long as it's done,
relatively, yeah, in a
as long as
short
it's done in
time, so you don't
2018.
forget.
Yeah,
Yes,
right.
yes.
go ahead.
Done.
Thank you.
Derek.
Can I just make one last statement?
Sure.
The federal tax credit for solar reduces to 26% in 2020, so 2019 is going to be a pretty big year, so if we can wrap it up by then.
Definitely want it much before then.
All right, if there's no other questions or comments or statements on this, we don't need,
I have one, I know I haven't
Good.
spoken, do you mind?
sure. If you could give us your name and address for the record.
I'm Brianne Amond, I live with David at 1400 West 149th Street. This is really purely aesthetics based. The fact, with our specific situation that is a hip roof and requires the triangular modules that aren't available is kind of a catch. I graduated with a degree in retail merchandising, so aesthetics to me is everything. Beauty is everything. The thing that I have an issue with is if it's about aesthetics and then you have to do a faux triangular module, that's going to be more displeasing than just cutting off the rails because it's not going to match exactly. It is going to be almost nearly impossible to make it look exactly like it, even as much money as you spend on it. I just wanted to make sure that was something that was also a consideration as well, and it was in thought too. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
thank you.
Would anybody else like to speak to this while we're getting close? Okay. With that, then we will anticipate that coming back to us in the next 30 to 60 days.
Yes, then we'll let the folks that were here tonight, let them know as well.
Yeah, and if we've got contact information, so there's a notification process on when this does come back around. All right. So, our next item on this evening's agenda is another discussion item. Is the City of Burnsville to consider amendments to City Code Title 10 zoning to incorporate changes from the Economic Competitiveness Study. And also presenting on this is Ms. Garros.
Far left.
Is that it?
No, you had it under slideshow. No, under slideshow. Oh, there's a single button for it. How about that?
Not Chris Lania, he's much younger. Younger,
Yes.
Hey, wait a
but
minute, Deb.
yeah,
He left us.
I
We
know.
like you more.
I know, it's like antiquated, time for, where is the, machine that you put the slides just on it?
Yeah.
It's about my speed.
Overhead
Okay.
projector.
All right, thank you,
You can
Commissioners.
really control that a lot better, though. I do miss that, too. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I remember making those slides, absolutely.
So, well, technology is here, so here we go.
Yep.
The Planning Commission had a work plan item last year that we worked primarily with WSB that did a study on commercial and industrial uses, taking a look at what, the various other cities have done, and then as a part of that, kind of what can be done for economic competitiveness to try to streamline our ordinance to the extent that we can to make things that are possible to make them permitted uses as opposed to having to go through a conditional use permit or something of that sort. The Planning Commission gave a number of recommendations on those. Some of those you decided were not important to do at this point in time or did not need review. We did take this to the City Council, and their direction was to proceed with drafting an ordinance, and then also to take a look at the, probably the most controversial provision would be the administrative review for conditional use permits and plan unit developments to what changes can be made administratively by staff as opposed to having to come back to Planning Commission and Council. And initially, the proposal was, I think, to change it from a 10% change in the cube of a building to up to 50%. Both Planning Commission and Council thought that was too extreme, too much. The City Council, though, thought that there is room to work and suggested we look at other types of things that may be more amenable. So what we tried to do is to identify some things that, from a staff perspective, we see that are common issues that come up that require people to come back for conditional use or PUD, that if we were to allow at a staff level, may reduce that time and cost factor for development. One of the other items that was discussed that Planning Commission wanted additional information on was the use for call centers and data centers. Right now, they're listed, I believe, as a permitted use, and staff had suggested separating them because from a staff standpoint, where we've been contacted for interest in these types of things, there are differences in the impacts of the use. So what we did is to create definitions which are on the top of the first page, and a call center primarily is an area where you're going to have a lot of telecommunications going on. It's going to have a lot of employees established at it, doing calls on a regular basis. So we included these types of information. The data center is probably one that we get more requests for, and that is really related to technology improvements, especially going to the cloud and some of those types of things. A lot of businesses, including the city, are looking to have off-site locations to host our IT data. And that's what we try to identify as a data center, is really those sites. There's usually not very many employees involved there. It's a larger facility. It's air conditioned, to deal with the actual equipment and components to store that data. So that is from those aspects. I think those are the primary items. We did include basically the draft shows where we are taking or proposing to take language out and then add additional language. A lot of that is just moving uses from a conditional use to a permitted use. And I am willing to, I can go through these to whatever extent the Planning Commission feels like going through them, or I can stand for questions.
I think we were all pretty well versed on this.
Yeah,
That's what I thought.
yeah, hope.
Spent a lot of time on this. Are there any questions for Ms. Garros?
Sure.
Commissioner Bradrick?
Okay. Ms. Girls, thanks. I agree that I think the call center, data center thing was a good, because one has traffic and one does not. So I think if I remember correctly, we spent a fair amount of time talking about the administrative approval of the changes to a PUD or a CUP up to 50% of the square footage of the product. I am probably alone on this from the standpoint that I would support a rather large percentage and allow staff to manage that. I think that's a more business friendly and a little more conducive to development. But I'd hope to have you maybe answer a couple questions for me that might put some of this in perspective. I'd like to make sure that I clarify that if someone's going to come in and let's say that we landed with 30% or 40, whatever number we landed with. Really what we're saying there is that the applicant has to meet all of the other zoning requirements and all of the other PUD requirements. So they're gonna have to meet all the landscaping, all the signage, all the exterior materials, all of the number of windows, all of the stormwater runoff, everything. They are simply coming to us and saying, we are going to increase the size of our building by X%, and everything else is in check. We're giving staff the ability to approve that application without bringing it back to us.
That's correct.
Okay. Because that's where I struggle with a smaller number than 50%, because in my opinion, there are going to be so many other triggers that may cause it to come back to us. They're gonna increase the size of the building by 50%, but they don't want to match the exterior of the building, or they want a variance when it comes to landscaping, correct? And so I just want to make sure that I had this straight in my head.
That's correct.
So, you know, I believe a big number is appropriate for the applicant from a standpoint of the church we just approved was a sizable increase to the existing building. We didn't make any changes. And we might have possibly saved them the process. So, Chair, that's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner Reddick. Any other comments, Commissioner Benke?
Yeah. Jim, I gotta say that part of what you're saying, I agree with. I think that there is a, I know, I knew you'd get that. But I wanted to take the opportunity right here to say that too. I think that there's some good things there. My hardest part with it is understanding more exactly what you're talking about. And Deb, I gotta throw a bunch of things at you, and you might not know the answers to these, but I gotta use them as examples. Prince of Peace was a prime example, I think, and you brought it up well. That did not exceed approximately 30% of the cube, which is a different discussion I want to have, because cube means volume, and we're using it in square foot, so we're using it in area form. So I'm having a little trouble with the language. But it did not change the square footage of the building by in excess of 30%.
There were other deviations that they needed.
I'm looking at the projects, but for that.
Okay.
So, but for those other deviations that they wanted, if that building came in, that could have been administratively approved.
Yes.
Okay. That's a significant building from a variety of aspects. I mean, you know how I feel about it significantly, but it's also a large building and a large structure in a very visible part of the city. Burnsville High School. They came in, they needed a plat, they needed some other things to clean up a bunch of stuff. Let's say they came in now and they wanted to increase the building by another 30%. But for any other variances, that building could get an administrative approval under these new rules.
Yes, if you increase the.
If we increase,
to
yeah,
the 30%.
yeah, everything I'm basing this on is that there's some increase to do it. Again, a very visible building, a lot of people go by it every day, they see construction. Home again, let's say that the Sears Holding Company, which you know the name of and I choose not to, let's say they came in and somebody else wanted that building. They made application to make the building larger. They met all the parking requirements. They met all the runoff requirements because they've got this huge parking lot. And that building had, you know, it was within those limits, we'd be able to approve it. Staff would approve it. Again, a large building in a significant part of the city that would impact a lot of people. Two of these, well, Berean needed a lot of other stuff though, didn't they?
Yes,
I mean, and that wouldn't be a great example because that would be one like you were talking about where there was enough other things obvious that were triggers that they were really putting a fairly large space onto a relatively large addition onto a relatively small lot. Not that it can't handle it, but it was definitely a fit. This is one that's got me sort of baffled. Our townhome project, Summit at Buck Hill, the original approval was an amendment to a PUD to Buck Hill. That added 67 townhome units to the property. The final phase was also an amendment to the PUD and added 32 units. Under the old 50% number, would the city have looked at that as an increase of less than 50% of the cube?
No, we looked at the cube as basically the square footage of the building. And you take the foundation, the perimeter of the building, so we would not approve additional or townhome units or something of that sort.
And this is sort of what I'm trying to get to is, where are the limits of what we're talking about here? Where are the edges where, if it's inside this edge, it's cool, and if it's outside the edge, I'm struggling with it in a real world sense, in terms of being able to say, oh geez, there's a building under construction over there, how come we didn't see it? And having a relatively subjective look at a building and saying, yes, that meets it, and this one doesn't. And that's where I'm struggling with it.
Well, adding townhomes is adding units, and that's much different than the footprint of a building
Sure.
and adding on a 500 square foot addition
Okay, but
or a 1,000 square foot addition.
Let's take it to the retirement building by Burnsville Center, by Diamond Head Mall. I still call it Diamond Head Mall. What if they have lots of space there? And I think at one of the meetings about the Orange Line, there was a number of people that lived there that came over, and the sense from them was that their building is wearing out, and it needs to be something else now. Or their building is sitting on so much property that it's ripe for densification. So if that building was to increase by 30%, but for any other variances, it met those standards, that would be approved under these new rules, just
Yes.
approved.
Yes.
Okay. Then I had, really the same thing happens with Burnsville Center, essentially. If they're not looking for any, with everything we're talking about there, if they want to increase the size of that building by 30% under the new rules. Now, the 30% that we're talking about that the council recommended, and, I'm trying to be conscious of how the council worded their recommendation too. They were talking about 30%, possibly talking about 30% where it was in the rear or less visible areas, not necessarily in the front yards.
The council thought that there should be more discussion, more opportunity for other options, and not just limit it to X percentage of the.
I agree, and quite honestly, I think that a lot of this is coming to the fore with many cities. You guys all know I still work in the business. I'm in front of at least 2 other cities in the next 2 weeks, and a third one probably after that. There's a lot of cities currently, irrespective of how Jenny gave it to council, there are a number of cities right now that are reviewing their performance standards. A lot of cities are trying to become more business-friendly, more amenable to development. We're not alone. And I do respect that means that we have to maintain our standard here. What I struggle with is where the citizens of the city have their opportunity to get a look at some of these projects. And that's the part that I'm trying to balance with my thoughts on it. A lot of times it feels like maybe I'm doing my architecture thing and it's something that I have personally, but in my mind, it's a goal for the city that hopefully is supported by other citizens. And I think that's where I always try to come from. So anyway, I'm wavering a lot about it because I'm not 100% sure yet on how I would recommend it to go. I was also struck though by the planner, Andrew?
Eric Weber?
Eric Weber.
Yes.
His review, very thorough, but that he found that currently we have the friendly approach, the most friendly approval process of all the market cities. So, yes, we have a benchmark there that we're at, we want to stay there, but we're already there in our area, according to his work. The only other thought, the only other comment I had was, I was looking through the background was, I don't know, I had two more things. I did notice that the approval process information that was at the back of our background left out some aspects, I think, of other cities' processes. Shakopee, for example, variances don't go to council. Variances don't go to planning commission. Variances go to the Board of Appeals, which that is the planning commission sitting in a different format, just as the council sits as the Economic Development Authority occasionally.
That's really dependent upon the type of city.
And that's what I was going to,
Exactly.
because I'm facing the same thing in Minneapolis as well. I go to the Board of Adjustments, but, and that may not be something available to us, not that we even want it, but I'm just pointing out that there are other ways of addressing some of these things. So, with that said, I guess I gotta back up here. This is another question I had, Deb, and I'm gonna give you these, because you have an overhead there, I believe.
We do,
If
as
they
long
wanna,
as the folks
see,
can
now we're
help.
back to old school. And Jim and I talked about this before. When WSB brought in their application, and what'd you put up, number 1 first?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, actually, no, put up number 2, I'm sorry. When WSB brought in their application for this addition to their building, they presented a project that, when I saw it built, I was surprised. And I mentioned it to Jim, and he sort of concurred to a point. I hope I don't misstate your words. Basically, what was brought to us at the meeting was an addition that was a relatively modern addition to a relatively dated building with a very hard to make connection. And the part of the architecture that was presented was that the new structure would sort of take, in architecture, we talk about how we deconstruct. When we're doing a building like this, sometimes the only way to put the two together is to deconstruct it. You take pieces of the old and you reflect it in the new, and there's a whole bunch of design aspects to it that I could get into if we wanted to sit here for another hour and a half. With that said, though, part of the thing was that I know you don't want to. Part of the thing was that the way I understood it, was that the entire addition was gonna be done in a black brick. This is a current pictometry from Dakota County, and the back of the building is not black. When you turn around and use 1, and I apologize because the pictometry had it in shadow. When you go back to 1, everything to the left of the angled corners has a black front. And if you go around the corner and look on the left side, you can see where, as you go, Deb, if you could sort of follow it, if you follow that corner up and then it jogs back and then up again, yeah, right where that jog is, it changes from black to brown. And I needed to bring it up because, to me, it fits under other aspects of the minor changes. And I wanted to ask Deb this. Deb, when that came in, was that the way it was presented, or was that a minor change that was approved without our review?
Commissioners, I don't know, this was not my project.
Right, and I,
But I will state that for modifications to color, we look at, there's not a requirement in the ordinance that says you can have these colors versus these colors.
sure,
And staff has administratively approved, other things. We look at more consistency with the existing as opposed to difference.
right, and quite honestly, guys, that's sort of my issue, is sometimes the consistency is not architecture. And you'll hear me say it many, many times. You can't have architecture with a checklist. I mean, that's not the definition of architecture.
Exactly.
And I know, and you're asked to administer it that way, though. I get that. And I struggle with it because I want you to have something that works well for you, but this kind of a change to me, I wouldn't, I'm the one that recommended this for approval. I'm the one that came with the motion, and then it was agreed to by everybody. I don't know that I would have made that recommendation had this been proposed. And I always come back to that when I see these changes. You know, and I know that India Palace and Nutmeg is the same thing, you know. Presented with one color, they built it with a different, oh, it doesn't matter. Well, it sort of does if it clashes to somebody. You know, even there was some changes that were suggested that I didn't see, you know, that we didn't really see in any of the future work. I know it's sort of a minor thing, but yet, to me, some of these things well, to me, they're major. I mean, it really is, because if we're approving something and something different gets built, then I don't think our job is at question in my mind. It's like, why are we here?
Well, I don't think that that's the case. When a project comes to you, it's not in its final construction phase.
Right.
So, you know, we try to work with the examples.
Right.
If Planning Commission, if you want to have every change come back to you, you can certainly do that, and we can add that to the ordinance.
Well, right, and you know, I think that that's not a goal, but yet, is there a limit where beyond that point, it should go back to be seen again? And I've sat out in the audience waiting for my turn in other cities, and I've heard planning commissions and councils make that same comment. I heard a council talk about a building that went up, this is in Edina, and the council said, that's not how I remember that thing being proposed. What happened? And the planner had to stand there and say, it was an administrative change that we made, and council wasn't happy about it. And, you know, sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. So I still think that there are elements of these draft changes that we probably should reduce to a work session as well. I think 90% of what's here or 95% of what's on here, we should let go through. I mean, we've already talked those to death. Mm-hmm. Or simply accepted.
Sure. Commissioner Bradrick.
I'd like to just clarify a couple things. One, I apologize. I used the example of Prince of Peace. And I truly find it hard to believe that any type of that size of a development is not going to trigger some other PUD
Correct.
change. So I truly, as I think about this is about the dental building in front of Home Depot, that nothing else was triggered. And so, you know, there's got to be a way for us to help our businesses from the standpoint of them being able to, that's a business that's been here for a long time, and they're well-standing in the community, they are gonna, you know, nothing else was different, and I don't know why they had to come in front of us. But, so that was my point, and then, but to be real honest, Commissioner Benke, we had a conversation about the WSB building, and it did get built differently than what we approved. So did Nutmeg. But looking back, I would tell you that would have not stopped me to having WSB building in the city of Burnsville, taking an old building that was empty. They brought jobs, they brought economic development, and they updated that building. Now, was it to what we may have specifically said? No. So I don't necessarily want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with staff not making decisions. But I think as a group, we've got to seriously consider giving staff some latitude to allow them to, because in some cases, we are not the city of Edina.
No.
We're not.
True. I think we're the next one though, so personally, you know, because of where we are. And I apologize for interrupting you.
No, so that's Chair, that's all.
And I agree, I think there's room for latitude, but I think there's also some more direction that's currently maybe lacking to staff, where there's some aspects of it that, you know, I think that there's some refinement to these rules. Allow changes to building exteriors and materials with equivalent or superior materials. Personally, I find that to be a highly subjective standard. Superior in whose mind? Equivalent, does equivalent mean different color but the same material? Does it mean the same color and a different material? Some of these standards to me are so loose that it allows virtually any change. And staff is gonna look at it, in my opinion, staff would look at it and go, well, I think it fits, so I'm gonna approve it, and then later maybe not, you know? And I don't know if Deb agrees with me or not on that one, but I do think that there are some holes in the direction that we have available for staff right now, personally.
Any other comments? Commissioner Singh, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I don't know, we can't want to give staff some latitude to make decisions. You know, when you bring everything to the planning commission, it costs the applicant money. And it takes a lot of time because it might be a situation where the applicant wants to get moving on the project. I am confident that we have good staff, experienced staff that can make decisions. Once you give that latitude, there will be occasions when we do not agree with them. And hopefully those are minor situations and not major ones. For me, the back of a building that wasn't painted what we approved, or, you know, it's not that important to me. As long as staff use their common sense and think that they were doing what's right. We got to give them a break sometimes. I mean, each one of us is an individual, and we see things a little differently, and we have to make room for that. So I hear what you say. I mean, the glaring cases, yeah, sometimes we bring it to staff's attention, and hopefully it does not happen again.
Thank you, Commissioner Singh, and I can't remember, Commissioner Walter, did you speak to this already?
I have not.
Would you like to?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to echo Commissioner Singh's comments.
Thank you.
Just one follow-up.
Yep.
It's rare that you find a building that is invisible from a direction. You know, and I've struggled with facade architecture where the front that people see on the plan, because it's a flat drawing, is all that gets treatment, and it doesn't turn the corners. And to me, that's where I think quality shows, personally. And I think quality is an aspect of what, in my opinion, the city needs to continue to strive for. Not that we don't have quality already, but, you know, Prince of Peace, I thought was a quality design,
Oh, yes.
you know?
Oh, yes.
And that's, you know, are we gonna get that on every project? No, I know that. But it's like there's pieces of it that I always feel like are missing. So you'll continue to hear from me.
I thought that 50% was high, and it probably did warrant, I think somebody mentioned a public hearing, or at least a opportunity to speak to something at that threshold. 30% seems to me to be more reasonable. I don't question our staff's ability. I do. Deb, what brought this up in the first place? Why is this a discussion item? Did we bring this up, or is this something that council had asked for, or staff, or why are we discussing this?
I think it's from council.
Okay.
Basically, they want to be able to be business friendly, and how can we do that? They wanted to know, in terms of economic competitiveness, do we turn away business or development because our standards are so restrictive or not? And where are we in that gamut? And that's really why the entire study was done, to talk about the uses and then also give you the, where the city ranks in terms of our ordinance
Yeah.
in those various elements.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think when we were discussing that, we were divided. I remember I was for 30%. I remember that thing very clearly. I don't know if staff, if council members looked at that tape, and they always do. I know they do look at tapes of our meetings.
Oh, yeah, they saw it.
And, I mean, I always thought that the 50% was high, was too high.
Deb, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Do we know offhand what the percentage increase of the dental building was relative to its?
I don't know offhand, but I'm sure it was more than 10%.
Oh, I'm sure of that
Yeah.
too. I was just wondering if it met the 30% standard.
That I would have to go back and
I
look at.
agree,
for
and
you.
and maybe that's a piece of information that I would love
Yeah,
to see.
okay.
Because, again, I'm looking for real-world examples
Yeah.
to be able to relate to where's the edge.
So, thank you, Chair. So, staff, we haven't helped at all, have we? What do you,
Two for two.
what kind of direction could we as a group, as our conversation helped, or what would be good to move this topic forward?
I think if you're okay with the majority of these changes, but you want to specifically have us come back on certain ones, we could proceed to develop an ordinance just for the ones that are amenable to planning commission, and then just include, it's more of a, work plan type of thing for the ones that have the issues. And that's, I'm sure, related to, the 30, 50% or any parameters for conditional use and PUD.
Makes sense.
Yep.
Would I be out of line to ask for that be brought as a work session item
Oh,
for
I
us?
support that.
I think
I mean,
there's,
quite honestly, I'd love to see more information about it. Not so much, well, yes, the Market City stuff, but more, where have issues been here? What projects have come in? I think it's the same thing. What projects have come in where this has been onerous for them? There's been an issue that having, I mean, on a $3 million project, a $1,750 CUP application is relatively normal. I mean, it's a normal cost of business. And where have there been issues? And I know that the dental building is probably the best visible
one I
one.
thought of.
So, but it's a good one. So what other ones are there like that too?
I think it would be most helpful for us if the commissioners told us which ones that you've had issues with, so
Well.
that we can take a look at those, as opposed to,
do you know what you just asked for?
well, I mean, really, and what are the
No.
issues? And then let's attack those.
Okay, well, I mean, I struggled with Nutmeg as an individual because, number one, it came in originally as a building permit only, yet it was clearly a greater than 50% increase in the building size, or approximately 50%. So how did that one get to where it was?
I know
And
that Nutmeg,
I
Nutmeg
know-
went through several renditions
I know-
and council
no,
approvals as well.
No, I know,
That
I
was
know.
pretty complicated.
Right, and I know there was a lot to it, and there was
Also
criticism, I
not my
get that.
project.
I know, I get that, but I mean, as an example, where were the issues there that could be
Sure.
learned from? And, part of it too, to me, is the end result, how, I would, what I come out of criticism is huge, but it's not criticism in terms of knocking things down. It's the criticism of discussing something and doing a critique of it. And I have a critique issue with some of the things that have happened at Nutmeg. And some of them have been resolved and some have not, but I like to see it as a learning experience and as a thing, okay, this happened in architecture, I wouldn't do that, and then just let you guys know sort of where I saw things as being incorrect. What else was there?
If I could address for Nutmeg,
Yeah.
from a staff perspective, the number one issue is that it didn't meet the ordinance.
Yeah.
The ordinance calls for, when you've got multi-tenant buildings, to have consistency, and planning commission and council wanted something different.
Well-
So that's kind of
Well,
where that comes into
Right,
play.
and maybe that's part of the issue to me,
Right.
because the consistency issue with separate buildings, separate uses, I mean, it wasn't a separate use to start with. It was an addition to the existing building.
No, it was a brew pub, a separate.
It came in first as an addition to, if I remember
As an
what Chris
event
told
hall.
me, as an event hall for India Palace, and then it turned into the brew
Brew
pub.
pub after that.
Okay, and but that's part of the problem too, I know. But to me, that consistency issue, it's like Aldi in the strip mall,
Yep, exactly.
okay? I
The
know
ordinance is
staff,
set up to do something different.
right, and maybe that's an aspect that we should visit as part of this, I don't know. Or if we could even, but I just, there are parts of that don't mesh with what I see as today's design aesthetic. And when I say what I see, I don't mean what I personally see, I mean what I see in the places where I go in the business. You know, a lot of times, different uses want a different identity. And it can look good, but that's, I think, where you run into issues with it needing review.
Exactly, and staff would not, that's why staff would recommended either the CUP or PUD amendment.
Right.
Because it did not follow the ordinance, and that's where the public input and
Right.
everyone's review comes into play.
Right.
Mike-
And I'm not trying to create a lot more work that way, but yet I'm trying to create more work where it's needed when those come in. And, you know, like I say, maybe there's an issue with that element of the ordinance that is dated now.
I'm gonna quick say something, I'm gonna give it to Commissioner Bradrick. My concern is if we overdo this, we're gonna end up having the same conversation we had before about our ordinance and why developers aren't coming to Burnsville, because our ordinance is so cumbersome and overburdening to them doing anything. Now, I understand that this is for redevelopment, but somebody buys an existing building and then decides to do something to it. Are we gonna be repeating what we just did tonight with solar panels? If we're gonna kind of keep adding these different layers and then a year from now look back at it and go, well, why do we have all these layers? That's my only, not my only fear, but that's probably my biggest worry about going too far into the weeds on this.
Well, yeah, and if I may, Jim, I know he was looking at you first. I think that some of these changes actually make it easier and cleaner. I think it removes some barriers if it's done thoughtfully and with great advice for staff. I mean, literally, I think that we do tend to, and I'm guilty of it too, we do tend to look at wanting to overregulate things. But I think there's stuff in our current ordinance that already is doing that we can remove and make things better.
Commissioner Bradrick.
Ms. Garros, getting back to your question, to answer your question about to maybe simplify this, there's a continuum of amendments to CUPs and PUDs. You're gonna have applicants with an amendment that are at the extreme end of the continuum where they're coming back for 10 to 12 deviations. And that is at the end of the spectrum where we are going to end up always seeing that. My question to you would be, as at the other end of the continuum, so whatever window of time we could look at, or I don't know what would be a feasible amount of time, the applicants the city have had, and could we take 65% of those applicants that are at that one end of the continuum that had enough variances to a CUP or a PUD that we knew in the end was going to come to us? I'm more interested in the 30 to 35% at the other end of the continuum where they truly only came to us with one or two small variances. And do we see a trend there where if we eliminated those small variances, whatever they might be, is it size of building, is it planting, is it parking, is it whatever it may be, but only look at and analyze that end of the continuum, whatever that number may be, and say these 30 applicants had a minor change, and if we tweaked something that would have allowed those to go through, I believe that is a big impact on that business and does not impact the things that Commissioner Benke is talking about.
Well, but, you know, and continuity of elevation could fit right in there too, though. You know,
Yeah, I don't know, but I'm just looking at
No,
the
no, but that's
number
what I
of
mean.
variances.
That's what I
for
mean.
PUD.
You know, you might have, in that 30%, you might have continuity of elevation as an
And
aspect
then we'll
of
have to
that.
look at it.
Right.
But we don't know what that number is.
Right, so all I'm saying is that before we turn it loose, maybe we should see if there's other related things that will address the chair's position
Is
as
it-
well.
Where we were headed is we were gonna look at those specific applications that Commissioner Bradrick was speaking to, and then see where can we cut some fat?
Yeah. And I think in the draft, we just tried to put together, based on council discussion, some ideas of things that can look at. I would say the types of things that come up all the time are, when you're dealing with a PUD, you've got an approved site plan. So if somebody wants to put in a pool building, another accessory building, something like that, they have to go through the entire PUD amendment. So what we're saying is, if it's something like that with an accessory structure and they can still meet the green space and setbacks and whatnot, that would be one opportunity. The other thing that
An
happens,
example, an actual live example would have been the woods.
yes, exactly.
The old folks on here would remember, you can't see it from anywhere from the
The most
street.
senior folks.
The old pool building
Elder
came down
statesmen.
and they had to do a PUD because it was slightly bigger. And I think if I remember right, they had to make the building bigger because of current ADA standards, and that forced them to come in
Right.
for a variance to the PUD.
That strikes me as a prime example of something that the exception should be written to accommodate that. I mean, that to me should not have happened also, you know. Quite honestly, I looked
I'm
at those.
sorry, I'm sorry,
No,
I interrupted, so go ahead, I'm sorry. But that was a good example that came
Yep.
to me
Another
while
one
you were
would be
talking.
the use, where the use is actually allowed now in the ordinance,
Right.
but it wasn't allowed in the ordinance at the time the CUP or PUD was approved. So in that case, probably the most prevalent one was at Fox Hollow Coffee Shop,
Yeah,
you know, where there were specific uses. Some town and country shopping center had specific uses that you couldn't have there, but yet they're allowed in the ordinance, you know, so those are the kinds of things that I think would be helpful to the existing property owners and businesses if they could do that, unless there's something specific, a specific reason in the approval why.
well, in Fox Hollow, it was because it was specifically supposed to be removed.
Yep.
And that would have brought it back for us anyway.
Yep.
So,
But uses, we spend a lot of time talking about what kind of uses would be
yeah,
allowed there and not, and,
well, and, yeah, yeah.
yep, so some of those things. But we certainly can bring this back and take a look at some of the applications and go through them.
Is my request feasible? Does that require hundreds of hours, or I don't know your system as to how you look through stuff like that.
It's gonna take quite a bit of time because we have to pull up all the plans and the approvals, so.
Could you just look at 2017?
How about pick one from each of the last 4 years, 5 years?
We're not here to, you guys need to use best judgment
True.
as to how you,
Yep.
But I don't think we need
We can take a look
I
through
don't
those.
think we need a comprehensive list of everything. I think it's some good examples.
Ask Mr. Zweber to do it.
Well, that's the other thing, you know, some of this may need to be paid for.
Yeah.
So we have to look at budgets, because it may
Yeah.
need to be done by outside consultants.
I think
That's
another-
for others, not us to
You know,
to have to
Devin, I
deal
think,
with.
I think we can, I think personally, I'll take a little responsibility for that too. As I make my travels around the city, I will probably send you a short list of things. What about this? What about that? And see if that can help as well. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
I'd encourage everybody else to maybe think the same way.
It's a good idea.
Yep, those examples, anytime there are examples, I think it helps everybody to
Yep.
kind of come to the same page and
So
hone down what the issues are.
we've just given Deb 2 in a row to come back to us.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yep.
But I think we have direction.
that's what you
to
get for
help
not
facilitate this.
bringing Regina with you. We ganged up on you.
I know, all right,
All right,
okay.
anything
Thank
else?
you.
Nope. Our last item on the agenda is updates. Are there any updates from the commission or staff? Seeing none?
I may as well right now. I will, is there there's not a meeting for us on at the end of April, is there?
It was rescheduled.
That was rescheduled to the 30th. That's right. I already let them know that I will not be,
So our next meeting is the 30th,
Yes.
I will not be at the 30th meeting,
30th of April.
30th of April.
I thought you said the 9th was canceled.
draft agenda for your
Oh,
April 9th meeting.
the 30th was canceled. All right. So 9th is on, 30th is canceled, correct? No, 23rd was moved to the 30th.
We were bumped.
We were
Yes,
bumped.
Oh, but we still haven't the night. Okay, I get it.
Okay. Any other updates outside of this?
Just to say, Mr. Chair, it's nice to have you back.
It's good to be back.
Our prayers have been, the good Lord responded to our prayers and brought you back.
Well-
You look like you're now fit.
Well, thank you. We have an excellent vice chair that did a wonderful job. I watched from home last week.
You're getting stalked, sir.
We're also glad to have Commissioner Singh back.
Yeah,
as
Commissioner
well.
Absolutely.
The feeling is mutual. With that, I would stand for a motion for adjournment.
So move.
We have a motion and a second. All of those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And the motion carries. Thank you. Have a good rest of your evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deb.